Hey everyone, and welcome to Sleepy Broadcast. What I want to make the case for today is that Family Guy's golden age was not killed off by bad writing or lazy writers. It was killed by success. Specifically, by the way, success dismantled every single condition that had made the golden age possible in the first place. The show that aired between 1999 and 2004 was built by a 24-year-old working with a $50,000 budget, no safety net, and a network that canceled him twice. The people in that writer's room were hungry in the way that people are only hungry when they genuinely do not know whether they will still have jobs next year. That hunger produced Band Geeks. It produced Road to Rhode Island. It produced a baby with a football-shaped head who was, without exaggeration, one of the most original comic creations in the history of American television. Then, the fans saved the show. Then, Fox signed a $100 million deal. Then, MacFarlane stopped writing the show entirely by 2010. Then the characters slowly lost everything that made them feel like real people. And the show kept going. More than 450 episodes, 24 seasons, what MacFarlane himself called escape velocity. Moving not because anything is pushing it forward, but because nothing has stopped it yet. This is the story of how that happened. And like all the best stories about failure, it starts with everything going wrong. But before we begin, I would just kindly ask you all to subscribe. It is completely free, and it helps this channel more than you know. Anyway, that is enough of that. Let us get into it. The underdog that wasn't supposed to survive. There is a version of this story where Family Guy never happens at all. Not because the idea was bad, not because the timing was wrong, but because the person who made it almost missed the window entirely. Seth MacFarlane was 24 years old when Family Guy first aired on Fox. 24. To put that in perspective, most 24-year-olds are still figuring out how to pay rent. MacFarlane was the youngest person ever to be the head producer of a major primetime television show. That is not spin or marketing. That is just what it was. And the fact that he got there at all is the kind of story that only makes sense when you look at it from the very beginning. MacFarlane grew up in Kent, Connecticut, a small town in the northwestern corner of the state. He was drawing cartoon characters before he could properly speak. By the time he was 9 years old, he was writing and drawing a weekly comic strip called Walter Crouton for his local newspaper, the Kent Good Times Dispatch. They paid him $5 a week. He took the work seriously. He always took the work seriously. When he graduated high school and went to the Rhode Island School of Design to study animation, he had one goal: to make cartoons for a living. He had planned to work for Disney. Then, he watched The Simpsons and changed his mind entirely. He wanted to make something for adults. His senior thesis at art school was a short animated film called The Life of Larry. It was a rough, unpolished thing. A middle-aged man and his talking dog getting into ordinary, low-stakes trouble. MacFarlane's professor liked it enough to send it to Hanna-Barbera, the animation studio responsible for shows like The Flintstones and Scooby-Doo. Hanna-Barbera hired him. He spent the mid-1990s writing and drawing for shows like Johnny Bravo, Cow and Chicken, and Dexter's Laboratory. He was good at it. He was learning the craft from the inside out. But the whole time, he was thinking about something bigger. In 1997, he pitched a version of what would become Family Guy to Fox. Nothing came of it immediately. But in 1998, after the success of King of the Hill proved that adult animated comedies could work on network television, Fox called him back. They gave him a very strange deal. They handed him $50,000 and 6 months to make a pilot episode. For context, a standard animated episode at that time cost at least $1 million to produce. Fox was giving him roughly 5 cents on the dollar and trusting that whatever came out the other side would be good enough to air. What MacFarlane did with that money in those 6 months says everything about where the show came from and why the early seasons felt the way they did. He worked a full day at Hanna-Barbera to keep his job. Then he went home and spent every remaining hour, nights, weekends, early mornings, drawing the pilot by hand in his kitchen. He barely slept. He had no crew to speak of. He was voice acting, writing, directing, and animating all at once. The pilot he delivered introduced the Griffin family of Quahog, Rhode Island. Peter, the well-meaning but dim-witted dad. Lois, his level-headed wife. Teenage daughter Meg. Overweight son Chris. Baby Stewie, who was secretly a British-accented evil genius plotting to kill his mother and take over the world. And Brian, the family dog who could talk, drank martinis, and was the most intelligent person in the house. Fox saw the pilot and greenlit the show immediately. Family Guy premiered on January 31st, 1999, in the best time slot in all of television, immediately after the Super Bowl. 22 million people watched the first episode. By any measure, that was a spectacular debut. The show was placed in Fox's Sunday night lineup between The Simpsons and The X-Files, two of the most watched programs on American television. For a little while, it looked like the show was going to be enormous. Then, the trouble started. Fox moved Family Guy to Thursday nights at 9 p.m. for Season 2. That put it head-to-head against Frasier on NBC, which was one of the most critically respected comedies on television at the time and had a loyal, established audience. Family Guy didn't stand a chance in that slot. Ratings dropped sharply. Fox pulled it again and moved it to Tuesday nights at 8:30 p.m., where it went up against Who Wants to Be a Millionaire on ABC, which in the early 2000s was the most watched show on American television, full stop. Family Guy finished as low as 114th in the national ratings that season, drawing just 6.3 million households. The show that had debuted to 22 million viewers was now being watched by fewer people than some local news programs. Fox canceled the show in May 2000. Not gracefully, not quietly, just gone. They did allow a third season to be produced and aired, but the writing was already on the wall. Season 3 premiered in the summer of 2001 on Thursday nights at 8 p.m., directly against Friends, the most watched scripted show in America at the time, and CBS's Survivor, which had become a genuine cultural phenomenon. The ratings were the worst in the show's history. Fox canceled Family Guy for the second time in 2002. One episode from that final season never even made it to air. It would eventually show up on Adult Swim in 2003, a quiet, unceremonious ending for a show that had once debuted in front of 22 million people. MacFarlane, by his own account, had nothing to compare the experience to. He had never pitched a show before Family Guy. When it got picked up the first time, he assumed that was just what happened when you pitched a show. He didn't fully understand how unusual it was. And when it got canceled twice, he sat with it. He tried other projects in the gap years. None of them felt finished the way Family Guy felt unfinished. He described it later as something that had been pulled away before it was done. What happened next is one of the stranger stories in television history. Fox, having canceled the show, tried to sell the rerun rights to other networks. They found almost no takers. A cable network eventually acquired those rights for what the president of 20th Century Fox Television later described as almost nothing, close to free. That network was Cartoon Network, and the block where Family Guy found a second life was Adult Swim. Adult Swim in 2003 was a late-night programming block aimed at young adults, running from about 11 p.m. onwards on Cartoon Network. It was not a prestige destination. It was where shows went after their main run. But something strange happened when Family Guy began airing in reruns there on April 20th, 2003. People started watching. Not a few people, a lot of people. The show became the highest-rated program on the entire block almost immediately. Adult Swim's viewership jumped by 239%. Young people who had been too young to watch the original run, or who had simply missed it the first time, were discovering Family Guy in the middle of the night and treating it like a secret they'd found. At the exact same moment, Fox released the Season 1 and Season 2 DVD box sets. This was the early days of TV on DVD. The Sopranos and The West Wing had proven people would buy television shows to own at home, but it was still a relatively new idea. Family Guy sold 400,000 DVD copies in the first month alone. Within a year, those first 2 seasons had sold 2.2 million copies and become the best-selling television DVD of 2003. The only television DVD that had ever sold more copies in its history was the first season of Chappelle's Show on Comedy Central. Season 3 followed and sold over 1 million copies on its own. An online petition to bring the show back gathered over 111,000 signatures. The numbers were now speaking a language that network executives could not ignore. On May 20, 2004, Fox ordered 35 new episodes of Family Guy. It was the first time in the history of American television that a canceled show had been brought back specifically because of DVD sales. Nothing like this had happened before. The revival that fans had been demanding was real. Season 4 premiered on May 1, 2005, with an episode called North by North Quahog, written by MacFarlane himself. It opened with Peter gathering the Griffin family to tell them they'd been canceled by Fox 3 years earlier. He then listed, in a long and increasingly absurd monologue, every Fox show that had been canceled in the years the Griffins had been off the air. Dark Angel, Titus, Undeclared, Action, That 80s Show, Wonderfalls, Fastlane, Andy Richter, Controls the Universe, and on and on. An enormous list of forgotten programs delivered as a kind of victory lap. The Griffins were back, and they knew it. The episode drew 11.85 million viewers, the highest ratings the show had seen since its very first season. MacFarlane said something interesting about the revival in a 2005 interview. He said the 3-year break had probably been good for the show. His reasoning was that animated programs almost never take breaks. They run season after season without stopping. And by the end of a long, uninterrupted run, what you see on screen is signs of a fatigued staff whose brains are just fried. More bathroom jokes, more lazy filler, less creative spark. The cancellation, as painful as it had been, had given the writers' room time to breathe. It had also forced the show to restaff its writers when it came back, which meant new people with new ideas and new energy, rather than an exhausted room running on fumes. What MacFarlane did not fully say, but what the evidence would later make clear, was that the cancellations had done something even more important than that. They had kept the show hungry. The golden age of Family Guy, seasons 1 through roughly 5 depending on who you ask, was made by a show that did not know if it would survive. Every episode was written by people who could not take the next season for granted. The cutaway gags were sharp because nobody had time to pad them out. The plots were grounded because the writers were still trying to prove the show deserved to exist. Peter was lovable because MacFarlane was still figuring out who Peter was and hadn't yet had years of commercial pressure to flatten him into a single repeated joke. The whole show had the texture of something being made by people who genuinely did not know what would happen next. That texture, that creative uncertainty, that hunger, is what the Golden Age was made of. And the revival, as wonderful and deserved as it was, began the slow process of taking it away. Because the show that came back in 2005 was not the same show that had been canceled twice. It was something new. It was a show that had been proved right by its audience. A show that had demonstrated it could survive anything. A show that had $1 billion franchise waiting to be built around it. and a creator who was about to become the highest-paid television writer in the world. The underdog that wasn't supposed to survive had survived, and surviving, it turned out, would cost it something it could never fully get back. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But before we get into what exactly was lost and how it happened, we need to spend some time with what the Golden Age actually was. Because to understand why it ended, you first need to understand what made it work. And that story starts with a 24-year-old, a $50,000 budget, and a very specific idea about what a family sitcom could be. Section 2. What the Golden Age actually was and why it worked. There is a specific feeling that comes with watching early Family Guy. It is hard to describe exactly, but anyone who grew up watching the first few seasons knows what it is. The show felt alive in a way that is difficult to manufacture. It felt like the people making it were genuinely enjoying themselves, genuinely surprising each other, genuinely trying things they were not sure would work. Episodes moved with a kind of confidence that was also somehow loose and playful at the same time. Jokes landed because they came from somewhere real. Characters felt like people rather than punchline delivery machines. And underneath all the weirdness and the absurdity and the cutaway gags, there was something warm running through almost every episode. A genuine affection for this deeply ridiculous family in this deeply ridiculous town. That feeling did not come from nowhere. It came from very specific creative decisions that the early writers made, sometimes instinctively, sometimes deliberately, about what kind of show Family Guy was going to be. The first and most important of those decisions was this. The show was always, at its core, about a family. That sounds obvious. The word family is right there in the title. But what it meant in practice was that no matter how strange any given episode got, no matter how far out into the absurd it wandered, there was always an emotional reality underneath it that kept the audience tethered to something they recognized. Peter Griffin in the early seasons was not just a collection of dumb jokes. He was a specific, recognizable kind of man. He was blue-collar, easily distracted, genuinely loving in a clumsy way, and completely unable to understand why the world did not work the way he expected it to. When he made a mess of something, which he always did, it came from a place of real feeling rather than pure stupidity. He wanted things. He wanted to be a good father. He wanted his wife to think he was smart. He wanted to be respected by people who would never respect him. Those wants made him human. And human is funny in a way that random chaos never quite manages to be. Lois was his counterweight. In the early seasons, Lois Griffin was one of the most underrated characters on American television. She had grown up wealthy. Her parents were rich, and her father, Carter Pewterschmidt, never let Peter forget it. But she had chosen a completely ordinary life in Quahog with a man her father thought was beneath her. That choice was never really explained, which made it more interesting. Lois clearly loved Peter with a sincerity that did not make logical sense, and the show was smart enough to let that love be real without making it sentimental. She had her own frustrations, her own running jokes, her own moments of genuine feeling. She was not just the wife who rolled her eyes at Peter. She was a full person in a full marriage, and the marriage at the center of the show felt like something worth caring about. Stewie was something else entirely. The concept of Stewie Griffin was one of the most genuinely original ideas in the history of adult animation. A one-year-old baby who spoke with a crisp, aristocratic British accent, who had built a working laser in his bedroom, who was actively plotting to murder his mother and conquer the world, and who existed in a household that largely ignored him as just a baby, was a brilliant piece of comedic construction. The humor came from the gap between what Stewie was and where he was. He delivered speeches about world domination while sitting in a high chair eating pureed carrots. He discussed the molecular composition of his weapons while being pushed through the park in a stroller. The contrast never got old because MacFarlane played it completely straight. Stewie was not winking at the audience. He genuinely wanted to kill Lois. He genuinely wanted to rule the earth. The fact that he kept failing, not because he was incompetent, but because he was a baby, and babies have no power in the world, was the entire joke. And it was a great one. Brian came from a different place. MacFarlane has said that Brian's voice is simply his own natural speaking voice. No character affectation, no accent. And in some ways, Brian in the early seasons was the version of MacFarlane that the show allowed him to put on screen. Brian was the most intelligent person in the Griffin house by a wide margin. He read books. He drank martinis. He could see exactly what Peter was doing wrong in any given situation and spent most of his time quietly despairing about it. He was also melancholy in a specific, quietly funny way. A dog who was aware enough to know that his life had not turned out the way he had hoped, but not self-aware enough to understand exactly why. That combination of genuine intelligence and gentle self-delusion made him one of the most interesting characters in the show's early run. And then there were the cutaway gags. The cutaway is the technique that most people associate with Family Guy, and in the Golden Age episodes, it was handled with a level of craft that is easy to overlook because it looks effortless. The way it worked at its best was simple. A character would say something, the show would cut away for a quick visual joke, and then return to the story without missing a beat. The key word there is return. The story was always still there. The cutaway was an interruption, not a replacement. It was a punchline delivered in a different medium before the scene continued. The early cutaway gags also had a specific quality that later ones mostly lost. They were observational. They were rooted in something recognizable, a shared experience, a cultural memory, a feeling everyone has had, but nobody has put into words quite like that. When Peter says something idiotic and the show cuts to a gag about a commercial he once saw, or a thing that happened to him as a kid, or a moment from popular culture that everyone in the audience carries around in their head, the joke works because it connects. The audience is not just watching the joke, they are recognizing something. That recognition is what makes comedy feel generous rather than just loud. In the Golden Age episodes, the cutaway gags also served the stories they interrupted. They were not random. They were related, however loosely, to what the character had just said or what the episode was about. They commented on the scene rather than replacing it. The story continued to move forward because the cutaway was a moment of breathing room, not a load-bearing wall. Remove the cutaway and the scene still made sense. The cutaway made it funnier. That relationship between the gag and the story was what kept the format honest. Season 2's Road to Rhode Island is probably the single best example of what the Golden Age was and how it worked. In that episode, Brian travels to Palm Springs to collect Stewie from his grandparents' house, and the two of them miss their flight and have to make their way across the country back to Quahog. That is the entire premise. It is not complicated, but what the episode does with that premise is extraordinary for a show that was still in its second season. For the first time, Brian's backstory is revealed. He was separated from his mother as a puppy and spent years trying to find her. And when he finally does, the encounter is both funny and genuinely sad in a way that the show had not really attempted before. Stewie and Brian's chemistry, which would later become one of the defining features of the whole series, is established here as something real and specific. They challenge each other. They make each other better. The episode ends with a musical number that calls back to the old Bing Crosby and Bob Hope road films from the 1940s, performed by MacFarlane with genuine warmth, and the whole thing lands as comedy and as something more than comedy at the same time. IGN gave the episode a perfect 10 out of 10. Their review said it had great writing, hilarious jokes, a catchy musical, and a story that's both hilarious and touching at the same time. It was nominated for a Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program. It lost to The Simpsons, which was still in its own golden age at that point, but the fact that it was in the conversation at all said something important about the level the show was operating at. Band Geeks from Season 2 is the other episode that fans bring up most often when they try to explain what made early Family Guy special. The premise of that episode is that Quagmire challenges the endlessly humiliated Quahog marching band, led by Stewie of all people, to perform at a halftime show. The episode is hilarious throughout, but it ends with Peter standing in front of his family after the performance, delivering a short speech to Meg that is one of the most genuinely touching moments the show ever produced. It is not played for laughs, it is played completely straight. And it works because the show had spent enough time establishing Peter as someone who genuinely loved his family, even when he was terrible to them, that the moment of sincerity felt earned rather than forced. That is the thing about the Golden Age that is hardest to explain to someone who only knows the later seasons. The comedy and the heart were not separate things. They came from the same place. When Peter was funny, it was funny because of who he was, because of his specific relationship with Lois, with his kids, with his friends at the Drunken Clam. When a joke landed, it landed because it was connected to something real. The show was not just delivering jokes, it was telling stories about people, and the jokes were how those stories breathed. There was also something specific happening in the writing room during those early years that is worth noting. MacFarlane himself was deeply involved. He wrote episodes, he sat in the room. He had strong opinions about who these characters were and what they would and would not do. The show had a clear creative center, a person whose instincts were driving the decisions, and that center held the whole thing together in ways that were easy to take for granted while they existed. The production process during the Golden Age was also genuinely difficult in ways that forced creativity. The average Family Guy episode takes a full year to produce from concept to air. In the early seasons, that year was spent under constant pressure. Commercial pressure, scheduling pressure, the pressure of a show that had already been canceled once and knew it could happen again. That pressure, rather than softening the work, seemed to sharpen it. When you do not have the luxury of coasting, you cannot coast. When every episode might be the last, you make every episode count. Seasons 1 through 5 are the years that fans consistently point to as the show's peak. Some extend the Golden Age to Season 7. The general shape of it is clear. The early seasons were made by a hungry show with a specific identity, specific characters, and a writing room that was still figuring out what it could do. The cutaway gags were tools, not crutches. The characters were people, not types. The plots had stakes, even small ones, and the endings usually meant something. None of this was accidental. It was the product of specific conditions. A small budget that demanded creativity, a creator who was genuinely present and driving the work, a room that was new enough to still be surprising itself, and a show that had no safety net and knew it. Those conditions were about to change completely. Because what the show did not know yet in those early years was that its greatest creative enemy was not cancellation. The cancellations, as painful as they were, had been the thing keeping it honest. The real threat was the opposite. The moment the show became so successful that it could never be canceled again, so popular that it could never be ignored, so profitable that it could never be allowed to simply stop. And the first sign of that threat came not from a bad episode or a bad decision, but from something much harder to argue against. It came from the people who loved the show most, the fans who bought the DVDs, signed the petitions, watched the Adult Swim reruns at midnight, and brought Family Guy back from the dead by sheer force of will. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What happened to the show once those fans had saved it, and what the weight of their expectations did to the creative decisions being made in the writer's room? That is where the real story of the decline begins. Section 3. the resurrection, and the unintended consequences of being saved by fans. When Fox canceled Family Guy for the second time in 2002, the decision felt final in a way that the first cancellation had not. The first time, in 2000, the show had at least been given a reprieve. A third season was ordered, produced, and aired. That third season was a real creative effort, not just a goodbye. But the second cancellation in 2002 was quieter and more complete. There was no reprieve. There was no third chance coming. One episode from that final season never even made it to television. It sat unreleased for over a year before eventually showing up on Adult Swim in 2003. That is how finished the show was. An episode existed that nobody had seen, and Fox had decided it was not even worth scheduling. Seth MacFarlane moved on. He tried other projects. None of them felt the way Family Guy had felt. He described the show later as something that had been left unfinished, not in terms of story, but in terms of what it could have become. The characters were still alive in his head. The world still had more to explore. But the show was gone, and at that point, there was no obvious reason to believe it was coming back. Fox, having canceled the show, tried to sell the rerun rights to other cable networks. This is standard practice. A canceled show's episodes have value as syndication content, and networks buy those rights to fill airtime cheaply. But Family Guy found almost no buyers. The show had been canceled twice. Its ratings in its final seasons had been genuinely poor. Nobody was rushing to acquire it. A network eventually picked up the rights for what the president of 20th Century Fox Television later described as almost nothing. The price was so low, it was essentially free. That network was Cartoon Network. The block where Family Guy aired was Adult Swim. Adult Swim in 2003 was a late-night programming block for young adults that ran from around 11 p.m. on weeknights on Cartoon Network. It was home to shows like Aqua Teen Hunger Force and Harvey Birdman, Attorney at Law. Weird, low-budget, cult-oriented programming that was not trying to reach a mass audience. It was, in the most straightforward sense, where television went after hours. Not a place anyone would have predicted would change the course of Family Guy's history. Family Guy began airing in reruns on Adult Swim on April 20th, 2003. What happened next was not gradual. It was immediate and enormous. The show became the highest-rated program on the entire block almost overnight. Adult Swim's overall viewership jumped by 239%. Young people who had either missed the show's original run or been too young to watch it were discovering it for the first time in the middle of the night, and they were telling their friends. The word spread the way things spread before social media made that process visible and fast, slowly at first, then all at once. Family Guy on Adult Swim was a genuine cultural rediscovery, and it happened in the dark, without any advertising or promotion, purely because the show was good enough that people kept watching. At the same time, Fox released the Season 1 and Season 2 DVD box sets. The timing was not an accident. The DVD release was coordinated with the Adult Swim premiere, but even the people who planned it could not have predicted how well it would go. Television on DVD was still a relatively new idea in 2003. The Sopranos and The West Wing had proven there was a market for it, but nobody had tested whether a canceled animated comedy could find a second life in that format. Family Guy answered that question immediately. The first 2 seasons sold 400,000 copies in the first month. Within a year, those sets had moved 2.2 million copies combined and become the best-selling television DVD of 2003. The only television DVD that had ever outsold it was the first season of Chappelle's Show on Comedy Central. Season 3 came out shortly after and sold over 1 million copies on its own. People were not just watching Family Guy on Adult Swim. They were buying it. They were owning it. They were watching episodes over and over in their bedrooms, in their dorm rooms, and in their living rooms at whatever hour they wanted. And then they started writing letters. An online petition calling on Fox to bring Family Guy back gathered over 111,000 signatures. Fans wrote directly to the network. Fan websites multiplied. The show that had been canceled twice and sold for almost nothing was producing some of the most passionate audience engagement in the history of American television. The president of 20th Century Fox Television said later that what happened with Family Guy on Adult Swim and DVD had led the network to take a second look. That this kind of devoted audience reaction had made it impossible to ignore. On May 20th, 2004, Fox announced that Family Guy was coming back. They ordered 35 new episodes, not a cautious 6-episode trial run, but a full, serious commitment. It was a historic moment. Family Guy became the first show in television history to be brought back from cancellation primarily because of DVD sales. Nothing like it had happened before. The entertainment industry took note. Studios started paying more attention to what their canceled shows were doing on home video. Season 4 premiered on May 1st, 2005, with the episode North by North Quahog, written by MacFarlane himself. The opening scene had Peter calling his family together to explain why they had not been on television for 3 years. He blamed Fox and then spent an extended amount of time listing every show Fox had canceled while Family Guy was gone. A long, absurd, increasingly funny list of forgotten programs that served as a kind of public settling of scores. The audience understood exactly what was happening, and they loved it. The episode was watched by 11.85 million people, the highest number since the show's very first season. MacFarlane said in interviews around that time that the 3 years away had probably been good for the creative process. Animated shows almost never take breaks, he explained. They run continuously, season after season, and by the end of a long, uninterrupted stretch, the fatigue shows on screen. You start to see more cheap jokes, more lazy writing, more signs that the people making it are running on empty. The hiatus had reset the room. The writers who came back for Season 4 were energized. The writing staff had been partially restaffed, which meant new voices and new ideas. The first few post-revival seasons, Seasons 4 and 5 in particular, are considered by most fans to be among the strongest in the show's history. Proof that the break had worked exactly the way MacFarlane said it had. All of this sounds like a perfect story. A beloved show wrongly canceled, saved by its fans through the sheer power of their loyalty, returning better than ever. And in many ways, it was. But inside that perfect story, if you look carefully, is the seed of everything that would eventually go wrong. Here is the thing about being saved by your fans. When Family Guy came back in 2005, it did not come back as a scrappy underdog show that nobody was sure would survive. It came back as a proven cultural phenomenon. The DVD numbers had made that undeniable. The Adult Swim ratings had made that undeniable. The petition with over 111,000 names on it had made that undeniable. The show was not just popular. It had inspired the kind of loyalty that made people spend their own money and their own time fighting for it. That is a different kind of popularity. That is a relationship between a show and its audience that carries weight. And weight, for a creative project, is not always a good thing. Before the revival, Family Guy had been made under conditions of total uncertainty. The writers did not know if the show would survive the season. They did not know if Fox would move them to a worse time slot, cut their episode order, or pull the plug entirely. They were making the show for an audience that was finding it, not one that had already committed to it. That uncertainty, uncomfortable as it was, had kept the creative decisions honest. You could not play it safe when playing it safe might still get you canceled. You had to try things. After the revival, the show's relationship with its audience had fundamentally changed. The fans who had brought it back had very specific ideas about what they wanted. They had bought the DVDs of the early seasons. They had watched those episodes dozens of times. They knew every running joke, every recurring gag, every character tick. They had come to love the show for what it had been, and they were expecting the revival to give them more of exactly that. This is where the pressure begins. Not network pressure, not commercial pressure, fan pressure. The pressure of an audience that feels a sense of ownership over a show because they genuinely helped save it. That audience had earned a kind of authority that is very difficult for a writer's room to ignore. When 111,000 people sign a petition to bring your show back, and 2 million people buy your DVDs, and your Adult Swim reruns AAA cable networks viewership, you owe those people something. Or at least, it feels that way. And that feeling of owing something to your audience changes how you make decisions. The early seasons of Family Guy had been made by writers who were trying to surprise themselves. The revival seasons were made, at least in part, by writers who were trying to give the audience what they already knew they wanted. Those are two fundamentally different creative positions, and they produce two fundamentally different kinds of television. There is also something specific that happened as a result of the show's revival that accelerated this dynamic considerably. Family Guy did not just come back as a television show, it came back as a brand. Fox understood immediately what the DVD sales and the Adult Swim numbers meant in commercial terms. This was not just a show with a loyal audience. This was a franchise waiting to happen. The licensing deals began. The merchandise appeared. T-shirts, action figures, video games, posters. The show became something you could buy at a store, something you could wear, something you could display on your shelf. That transition from television show to commercial product happens to a lot of successful programs, but it happened to Family Guy very quickly and very completely, and it brought with it a set of pressures that had nothing to do with making good television. When a show becomes a product, the people responsible for it have to start thinking about the product. They have to think about consistency, making sure the thing people are buying at the store matches the thing they see on screen. They have to think about recognition, making sure the characters look and sound and behave in ways that are immediately identifiable to someone who has only a casual relationship with the show. These are not creative considerations, they are commercial ones. And over time, commercial considerations have a way of quietly overriding creative ones. Not in any dramatic confrontation, but in 1,000 small daily decisions that each seem reasonable on their own. Seth MacFarlane himself has spoken about this with remarkable honesty. In a 2024 interview with the LA Times, he said that there was a time when he thought it was time to wrap Family Guy up. He acknowledged that the show had reached a state where it was continuing not because there was something urgent left to say, but because the machine had achieved what he called escape velocity, a point where stopping would require more justification than continuing. The fans were still watching, the merchandise was still selling, the network was still ordering seasons. From a business perspective, there was no argument for ending it. But from a creative perspective, the argument had always been simpler and harder to make. The show was best when it was hungry, and hunger is the one thing that success cannot give you. The fans who saved Family Guy did so out of genuine love for what the show had been. That love was real, and it mattered, and without it, the show would have stayed dead. But the act of saving it also transformed it. It turned a canceled underdog into an institution. It turned a show that had nothing to lose into a show that had everything to protect. And protecting what you have, as any writer will tell you, is the opposite of the mindset that produces great work. The golden age had been built on risk. The revival would be built on expectation, and those two foundations produce very different buildings. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What the revival did to the show's characters, particularly to Peter, Stewie, and Brian, the three figures at the heart of everything Family Guy had been, is where that difference becomes impossible to ignore. Section 4. The $100 million problem when success becomes a machine. There is a moment in the life of almost every creative project where it stops being a creative project and starts being a business. For some shows, that moment comes early, and the show never really recovers. For others, it comes slowly enough that the audience barely notices until they look back from a distance and realize something changed. For Family Guy, the moment is unusually well documented. There is a specific number attached to it. There was a specific date, and there is a direct line between that number, that date, and the slow transformation of the show from something genuinely dangerous and alive into something that functioned more like a machine, producing a reliable product on a regular schedule. The number is $100 million. The date is May 4th, 2008. That was the day Seth MacFarlane signed a deal with Fox to keep Family Guy and American Dad running through 2012. The deal made him the highest-paid television writer in the world. He was 34 years old. He had started working on Family Guy at 23, sold it to Fox at 24, watched it get canceled twice, fought to bring it back, and now, less than 3 years after the revival, he had negotiated himself into a position that almost no creative person in the history of television had ever occupied. $100 million to keep making 2 animated shows. The kind of money that does not just change your bank account, the kind of money that changes the way you think about what you are doing and why. To understand what that deal meant for the show, you have to first understand what Family Guy had become financially in the years between the 2005 revival and the 2008 contract. Between 2005 and 2008, the show generated over $1 billion in total revenue. That number breaks down in a way that tells a very specific story. Around $400 million came from syndication deals, other networks paying to air reruns. Another $400 million came from DVD sales, building on the enormous numbers the show had already put up before the revival. $200 million came from merchandise, t-shirts, posters, action figures, mugs, keychains, video games. More than 500 Family Guy products were eventually licensed to retailers, including Walmart and Target, generating an estimated $100 million per year in merchandise revenue alone. That is what 3 years of a revived television show produced $1 billion. For context, the show had originally been made for $50,000. The distance between those two numbers, 50,000 and 1 billion, is not just financial. It is a measure of how completely the show's situation had changed and how different the pressures on it had become. MacFarlane's net worth at the time of the 2008 deal was growing rapidly. By the time of writing in 2026, it is estimated at around $400 million. The Family Guy franchise was the foundation of all of it. And when you are the foundation of a $400 million personal fortune, you are no longer just a writer making a show you love. You are a business. The show is your product. The audience is your market. And markets, unlike artistic visions, require consistency and reliability, and the careful management of expectations rather than risk-taking and experimentation. This is not a criticism of MacFarlane personally. He is, by all accounts, a genuinely talented person who cares about his work. But money on that scale does something to creative decisions, whether you want it to or not. It makes certain choices feel irresponsible that would previously have felt brave. Ending the show when it has creative momentum, that costs money. Taking the show in a genuinely new direction that might alienate part of the audience, that costs money. Letting characters grow and change in ways that might complicate the merchandise, that costs money. Every creative choice, once the show becomes a machine generating that kind of revenue, has a financial consequence attached to it. and financial consequences make people cautious in ways that are very bad for comedy. What makes the 2008 deal particularly significant is what happened to MacFarlane's own involvement in the show around the same time. During a 2017 Reddit session where he answered questions from fans, MacFarlane revealed something that most people found genuinely surprising. He had not written a single episode of Family Guy since 2010. The man who created Peter Griffin, Stewie Griffin, Brian Griffin, and Glenn Quagmire, the man who voiced all four of them in every single episode, had not written for the show in over a decade by the time that session took place. He was still the executive producer. He was still the public face of the show. He was still doing the voices. But the actual writing, the day-to-day creative decisions about what happened in each episode and why, had been handed entirely to a staff of writers who were working without him. MacFarlane has explained this partly through the logic of his expanding workload. By the late 2000s and early 2010s, he was simultaneously overseeing Family Guy and American Dad, developing the Cleveland Show spin-off, recording jazz albums, performing at Carnegie Hall and the Royal Albert Hall, and writing and directing Ted, his 2012 feature film that grossed over $500 million worldwide. He hosted the 85th Academy Awards in 2013. He was, by any measure, one of the busiest people in American entertainment. The Family Guy writers' room was in capable hands, staffed by professional comedy writers with real credits. The show would continue to function without his daily presence. And it did continue to function. It continued to air. The ratings remained solid. The merchandise kept selling. The machine kept running exactly as a machine is supposed to run. But a machine running is different from an artist working. And the show that had been produced by an artist working, a specific, passionate, sleep-deprived artist who had drawn it in his kitchen because he could not imagine doing anything else, was different in ways that are easy to feel, even when they are hard to quantify precisely. MacFarlane's direct writing contribution to Family Guy consists of 3 episodes across the entire run. Death Has a Shadow, the very first episode, Family Guy viewer male number 1 from Season 3, and North by North Quahog, the Season 4 revival premiere. 3 episodes out of over 400. The show that bears his name and his vision and his voice was, almost from the beginning, being written by other people. What the Golden Age had going for it was that those other people were working in a room where MacFarlane was present, where his instincts were shaping the decisions, where the creator's sense of who these characters were was alive in the space every day. Once that presence faded, once MacFarlane stepped back to focus on his broader empire, what remained was a very professional, very capable, very well-funded operation, producing episodes of a show that had once come from somewhere much more personal. The Cleveland Show, which launched in 2009 as a Family Guy spin-off following Cleveland Brown, illustrated this dynamic from a different angle. The show ran 4 seasons and was canceled in 2013. MacFarlane's involvement was minimal from the start. He voiced a small supporting character for the first couple of seasons before handing that role to another actor. Notably, the moments in the Cleveland Show that fans most responded to were the ones where Family Guy characters crossed over and appeared. The very fact that cameos from the parent show were often the most enjoyable parts of the spin-off said something honest about what happened when MacFarlane's core creations were extended into territory he was not personally invested in. American Dad told the opposite story and is worth paying attention to for exactly that reason. American Dad, which MacFarlane co-created with Mike Barker and Matt Weitzman in 2005, started as a show MacFarlane himself struggled to connect with. He has said that he found the early seasons difficult to understand creatively. But what happened over time was that he largely stepped back and let Barker and Weitzman run it. Freed from being Seth MacFarlane's flagship show, freed from the pressure of living up to Family Guy's reputation, American Dad was allowed to develop its own identity. Its characters grew in genuinely unexpected directions. Roger the Alien became one of the most creative comic characters in adult animation. The show took real risks because nobody was protecting a billion-dollar brand. By the early 2010s, a significant number of critics and longtime fans had reached a conclusion that would have seemed impossible in 2005. American Dad had become better than Family Guy. More consistent, more daring, more willing to commit to a joke or an idea and follow it all the way through. The show MacFarlane cared less about had outgrown the show he had poured everything into, precisely because caring less had meant controlling less, and controlling less had meant the writers could breathe. The financial structure of Family Guy's success created one more pressure that is worth understanding in detail, because it shaped the show in ways that went beyond just the writing room. The episode production cycle for Family Guy is approximately 12 to 14 months from initial concept to air date. That is a full year from the moment a writer pitches an idea to the moment an audience watches it. During that year, the show's producers are making decisions about merchandise, about marketing, about the character designs that will appear on products in Walmart. Characters cannot change significantly during that year because the merchandise has already been designed based on what the characters looked like when the production cycle started. The show is locked into a visual and characterial consistency by the time it reaches the screen, because the commercial apparatus around it requires that consistency months before any episode airs. This is why the characters in Family Guy stopped growing. Peter could not become meaningfully smarter or kinder or different in any lasting way, because Peter on a coffee mug at Walmart needs to look and behave like the Peter that every casual fan recognizes. Stewie could not return to genuine menace and complexity because Stewie on a t-shirt is the round-headed baby saying something funny, not the character from season 1 with a working laser and a genuine desire to end his mother's life. The merchandise did not just reflect the show's characters. In a very real sense, it began to define them. The characters became their own brand identities, and brand identities do not evolve. MacFarlane himself, speaking to the LA Times in 2024, said something that captures this situation with unusual clarity. He said that there had been a time when he thought the show should end. He acknowledged that openly. Then he said that the show had reached a point he called escape velocity, where the momentum of the machine made stopping it harder to justify than continuing. People still loved it. It was making people happy. It was funding things he cared about. From that perspective, the argument for ending it did not hold up against the argument for continuing. What that framing reveals, if you look at it carefully, is that the decision to keep the show going had shifted entirely from a creative question to a practical one. The question was no longer whether the show had something genuine left to say. The question was whether there was a good enough reason to stop. Those are opposite questions, and they lead to opposite kinds of television. In the Golden Age, every episode existed because the writers had something they wanted to do. In the later seasons, every episode existed because the machine required feeding. The show was no longer being made from a position of creative desire. It was being made from a position of institutional inertia, kept alive by a commercial structure that had grown too large and too profitable to shut down based on something as unquantifiable as artistic integrity. None of this happened because anyone was being deliberately cynical or dishonest. MacFarlane is clearly a person who cares about quality and has spent decades trying to do good work. The writers who staffed the room in later seasons were talented professionals doing their jobs well. But the conditions they were working in, the financial weight, the merchandise obligations, the audience expectations, the absence of the show's creator from the actual writing process, were fundamentally different from the conditions that had produced the Golden Age. And different conditions produced different work. The machine was running. The machine would keep running for years. But something important had been left behind when the machine first started up. Something that no amount of money or success could manufacture once it was gone. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Understanding exactly what that something was requires looking closely at the characters themselves, at what they were in the Golden Age, and what they became once the machine took over. And nowhere is that transformation more visible, more documented, and more painful for longtime fans than in what happened to Peter Griffin. Section 5. Peter Griffin and the Death of the Lovable Idiot. There is a version of Peter Griffin that people genuinely loved. Not in an ironic way, not in the way you love something, because it is so bad it becomes funny again. In a real, uncomplicated way. The Peter Griffin of the early seasons was a character that audiences connected with because he was recognizable. Not as a perfect person, not as someone to admire, but as someone to understand. He was the kind of man who existed in every neighborhood, every workplace, every family gathering. He talked too loud and thought too slowly, and made decisions that seemed reasonable to him in the moment and catastrophic to everyone around him. He loved his family with a fullness that his intelligence could never quite keep up with, and that gap between how much he felt and how little he understood was where all the best jokes lived. The Peter Griffin of the early seasons had a specific shape to his stupidity. It was not bottomless. It had edges and a floor. He was the kind of stupid that came from a man who had never been pushed to think carefully about anything, who had coasted through life on charm and luck and the particular social grace of someone who does not realize he has no social grace. He was a man who genuinely believed he was smarter than he was, which is a very different thing from a man who simply has no mind at all. That belief, that quiet, unearned confidence, was the engine of most of his best storylines. He would get an idea, pursue it with total commitment, and the comedy came from watching the gap between his certainty and reality slowly widen until everything collapsed. But he loved his family. That part was never in question in the early seasons. There is an episode in Season 1 called A Hero Sits Next Door, where Peter tries to compete with his new neighbor, Joe Swanson, a wheelchair-bound police officer who becomes a local hero. The episode is funny and silly, and everything you expect from the show in that era. But underneath it, Peter's motivation is completely human. He wants to be someone his family can be proud of. He wants Lois to look at him the way she looks at Joe. He wants his kids to brag about their father. The comedy comes from how badly he fails at achieving that, but the wanting is real, and it makes him real. In Season 2, there is a moment near the end of Band Geeks, the episode where Quahog's marching band performs at a halftime show, where Peter stands in front of his family after the performance and turns to Meg. He looks at her directly and tells her something kind and genuine. The moment is brief. The show does not linger on it. But it works because everything leading up to it has established that Peter, for all his failures as a father, genuinely sees his children and cares about them. The warmth is real. The audience feels it because the writers had spent enough time establishing it. That is the Peter Griffin the fans fell in love with. Stupid, yes. Selfish sometimes, yes. Capable of spectacular failures of judgment on a weekly basis, absolutely. But underneath all of that, a man who was trying. A man whose heart was in roughly the right place, even when his brain was nowhere near it. The transformation began gradually after the revival, and then accelerated sharply around Season 5 and into Season 6. The episode most frequently identified as the turning point is Petarded, which aired in Season 4. In that episode, Peter discovers through a series of tests that he has a borderline intellectual disability. The episode plays this partly for laughs and partly for something that gestures toward genuine feeling. Peter is hurt by the discovery. He feels diminished. The episode is not without heart. But what Petarded did to the character in the long run was give the writers a justification. Once it had been established within the show's own world that Peter was clinically below average in terms of intelligence. The writers had a kind of permission slip they had not had before. Any behavior, no matter how extreme, any decision, no matter how cruel or senseless, any action that in a real person would suggest serious psychological problems could now be filed under the same category. Peter is just that stupid. The disability diagnosis did not deepen the character. It flattened him. It gave his stupidity a label and a limit, and in doing so, it made his stupidity absolute rather than specific. From Season 5 onwards, and reaching its worst from Season 8 onwards, Peter Griffin became a different character almost entirely. The process was not sudden. Each individual episode made small steps in a direction that only became alarming when you looked at the full distance traveled. He became meaner. His treatment of Meg shifted from the thoughtless neglect of a distracted father to something that looked increasingly like deliberate cruelty. He began doing things to his family that had no basis in love, however twisted. Things that were simply harmful, done for no reason the story ever honestly explored. The episode April in Quahog from Season 8 is often cited as a moment where Peter's transformation reached a kind of peak. In that episode, believing the world is about to end, Peter spends his final hours with his friends at the bar rather than with his family. When it turns out to be a false alarm, the episode does not treat this as a character failing that Peter needs to reckon with. It treats it as just another thing that happened. The emotional consequences that earlier seasons would have made the center of the story are absent. Peter does not reflect. He does not grow. He resets to the same position he was in at the start of the episode and moves on. This reset, this total absence of consequence or growth, became one of the defining features of Peter in the later seasons. Earlier, Family Guy had operated on a loose version of the same principle, but the difference was significant. In the early seasons, the reset happened after stories that had at least gestured toward real stakes. Peter would do something wrong, face some version of the consequences, experience something that at least resembled reflection, and then return to normal. The return to normal was the format's requirement, but the journey through the episode had meaning. In later seasons, the reset happened after stories where Peter had done things so extreme, so far outside the range of a recognizable human being, that no reset could make him sympathetic again. He had not done something stupid and funny. He had done something genuinely terrible, and then the episode ended, and nobody mentioned it again. His relationship with Lois deteriorated in parallel. The early seasons had presented their marriage as one of the show's genuine achievements, a relationship between two people who had no obvious reason to work as a couple and somehow worked beautifully anyway. Lois was smarter, more composed, and from a significantly wealthier background. Peter was none of those things, but their love for each other was one of the most convincing things in the show, portrayed with a warmth that made even the most outlandish episodes feel grounded. By the later seasons, that warmth had been largely replaced by a dynamic where Peter treated Lois with a level of disrespect that the show presented as comedy. But that would, in any real reading of the relationship, represent something much darker. Episodes in which Peter is shown pursuing other women, dismissing Lois entirely, or treating her with open contempt became increasingly common from Season 6 onwards. The marriage that had been the emotional center of the show became just another source of cheap jokes. His relationship with his children followed the same arc. Chris, who in the early seasons was a specific and genuinely funny character, a slightly dim but artistically talented teenager with his own insecurities and his own small dramas, was gradually reduced to a version of Peter with slightly less screen time. His artistic ability, which had been one of the most interesting things about him, largely disappeared from his characterization. Meg's situation was even more extreme and deserves its own detailed attention, which it will get later in this video. But the short version is that Peter's treatment of Meg shifted from the benign neglect of an inattentive father to something that the show's own writers, in a season 10 episode called Seahorse Seashell Party, had to explicitly address because it had become impossible to ignore. In that episode, Meg finally confronts her family about the way they treat her, and her speech is so accurate and so painful that it functions less as comedy and more as an admission by the writers that they knew exactly what they had done to the character and were choosing to continue doing it anyway. The specific episode most fans point to for Peter's relationship with Stewie is Brian Griffin's House of Pain from season 9. Without going into extensive detail, the episode contains a sequence involving Peter's treatment of Stewie that many longtime viewers found genuinely difficult to watch. The character had, by that point, traveled so far from the man who would have taken a bullet for his children in season 1 that the distance felt less like character development and more like character replacement. The person on screen was using Peter's face and Peter's voice and living in Peter's house, but behaving in ways that the original Peter Griffin would not have been capable of. What drove this transformation? Several things working together. The first was the writing room dynamic. As MacFarlane stepped back from day-to-day involvement, the room was left to develop its own momentum. Comedy writers working under pressure to produce something funny every week naturally gravitate toward escalation. If a joke about Peter doing something stupid got a laugh, a bigger version of the same joke might get a bigger laugh. If Peter being rude to Meg was funny, Peter being crueler to Meg might be funnier. Each individual step in this escalation seems small and defensible. The cumulative effect is enormous. The second was the removal of consequences. A show with no memory, where events reset between episodes and nothing that happens in one installment affects the next, gradually loses the ability to make its characters accountable for anything. Peter could behave in increasingly extreme ways because none of it ever mattered. There was no episode where the family sat down and said, with genuine feeling, that things could not continue this way. There was no story arc where Peter's worst tendencies cost him something real and lasting. The show's format, which had always operated on a loose version of this reset principle, became something more total and more damaging as the behavior being reset grew more extreme. The third was the commercial logic discussed in the previous section. Peter Griffin on merchandise needed to be recognizable as Peter Griffin. That meant the broad strokes of the character, big, loud, stupid, beer in hand, had to remain consistent. The subtler qualities that had made him human in the early seasons were exactly the qualities that do not translate to a coffee mug or a t-shirt. You cannot sell the quiet warmth of a man who genuinely loves his family even when he fails them. You can sell a big guy with a round belly making a dumb face. And so the big guy with the round belly making a dumb face was what the character became. Seth MacFarlane himself has acknowledged in various interviews over the years that the writers agreed at some point that Peter's original personality was starting to feel dated, and they began writing him differently. That is an honest admission. It is also, in retrospect, a description of the moment when one of television's most genuinely enjoyable comic characters was quietly retired and replaced with a louder, simpler, meaner version of himself. The Peter Griffin of the Golden Age was worth caring about because he was worth understanding. The Peter Griffin of the later seasons was a collection of behaviors without a person behind them. The show kept his name and his voice and his house and his family, but the specific human quality that had made him funny, that gap between how much he felt and how little he understood, had been replaced by something that felt much emptier. And what happened to Peter was not unique. The same process, driven by the same forces, played out across the entire cast. Every major character in Family Guy went through some version of this same journey, losing the complexity and humanity that the Golden Age had built and replacing it with simpler, louder, more extreme versions of their most recognizable traits. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. it helps the channel tremendously. But of all the characters whose transformation changed the show's identity most deeply, the case of Stewie Griffin stands alone. Because what was lost when Stewie changed was the single most original creative idea the show had ever produced. Section 6. Stewie Griffin, the best character on television, slowly dismantled. There has never been another character quite like Stewie Griffin. That is not an exaggeration. Across the entire history of American animated television, from the earliest Looney Tunes shorts through The Simpsons and South Park and everything that came after, nobody had ever put a character like Stewie on screen before Family Guy did it in 1999. The premise was deceptively simple. A one-year-old baby who was secretly a diabolical genius with a working laser, a hidden laboratory, a crisp British accent, and a burning desire to murder his own mother. That was it. That was the whole idea. And in the hands of Seth MacFarlane, who based Stewie's voice on the English actor Rex Harrison's performance in the 1964 musical film My Fair Lady, that simple idea became one of the most consistently funny and genuinely original characters that adult animation had ever produced. What made Stewie work in the early seasons was not just the concept. Plenty of animated shows have strange premises that stop being funny after a few episodes. What made Stewie work was the complete and total commitment to playing it straight. The show never winked at the audience about how absurd Stewie was. He was not presented as a joke. He was presented as a real person, a person who happened to be 11 months old and living in a house in Rhode Island, with genuine ambitions, genuine grievances, and genuine plans for world domination that he pursued with the seriousness of someone who fully expected to succeed. His relationship with Lois was the engine of the character in those early seasons. Stewie despised his mother with a passion that was specific and detailed and absolutely committed. He did not simply dislike her. He had thought carefully about why she needed to be eliminated, had built weapons designed specifically for the task, and returned to the project with renewed energy in episode after episode despite constant failure. The comedy came from the gap between the scale of his ambition and the reality of his situation. He was a baby. His plans kept getting derailed by nap time and meal times and the basic physical limitations of being 11 months old. The contrast between his magnificent, theatrical hatred and the tiny, powerless body he was trapped in never stopped being funny because the show never let Stewie acknowledge the absurdity himself. He always believed he was on the verge of winning. In Season 1, Stewie builds a mind control device. He attempts to poison Lois's breakfast. He constructs a weather machine. He plots, schemes, and delivers speeches of genuine rhetorical quality to a living room that ignores him entirely. The family, with the partial exception of Brian, treats him as a baby who is saying baby things, which means his most elaborate declarations of war are met with the same mild distraction that greets any toddler babbling in a corner. That dynamic, the genius screaming into the void of parental inattention, was one of the most perfectly constructed running jokes in the show's history. Wizard magazine named Stewie the 95th greatest villain of all time. Entertainment Weekly placed him 45th on their list of the top 100 characters of the previous 20 years. IGN named him the best character in Family Guy. MacFarlane won a Primetime Emmy Award in 2000 for his voice performance as Stewie, making Stewie one of the very few animated characters to earn that kind of individual recognition in the award's history. The Road to Rhode Island episode in Season 2 introduced something new alongside Stewie's established villainy. It showed, for the first time, that Stewie and Brian had a genuine chemistry when placed together outside the house. They challenged each other. They were funny in ways neither was quite as funny alone. The episode established the foundation for what would become one of the most beloved dynamics in the show's entire run, the odd friendship between the murderous baby and the sad, intelligent dog. That friendship was built on the original version of Stewie. the one who was genuinely menacing, and whose occasional softer moments landed with real force precisely because they were so rare and unexpected. The Road to series of episodes, which began with Road to Rhode Island in Season 2 and continued through several more installments, are almost universally considered the finest episodes the show ever produced. They work because they give Stewie and Brian a contained adventure with real stakes and real character moments, and they support those moments with elaborate musical numbers that MacFarlane clearly loved making. The format brought out the best in both characters because it forced the writers to treat them as full people rather than joke delivery systems. Then came the change. It did not happen all at once. The writers themselves have explained the reasoning, which makes it both understandable and frustrating in equal measure. By the middle of the show's run, they felt they had taken the evil baby premise as far as it could go. Stewie had tried to kill Lois dozens of times. He had built dozens of weapons. The joke, in their view, had run its course. They needed to take the character somewhere new. The Season 6 two-part episode, Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie, represents the last time the show engaged with Stewie's original premise at full scale and full seriousness. In those episodes, Stewie actually follows through. He actually shoots Lois. The show commits to the consequences of that action across 2 full episodes, and what results is genuinely some of the finest storytelling Family Guy ever attempted. The episodes are tense and funny and strange in exactly the right ways. They answer the question the show had been asking since its first episode. What would actually happen if Stewie succeeded? And the answer is both funnier and more unsettling than anyone had expected. Those 2 episodes remain among the most critically praised in the show's history, and they represented, though nobody knew it at the time, a kind of farewell to the original Stewie Griffin. After that arc, the show began the process of softening him. His murderous ambitions did not disappear entirely. They surfaced occasionally in later seasons, sometimes in genuinely funny ways, but they were no longer the center of who he was. The writers began exploring his sexuality instead, hinting across multiple episodes that Stewie might be gay. His cell phone screensaver was a muscular man. He kept a photograph of the actor Chris Noth in his wallet. Episodes like Turkey Guys and Send in Stewie Please brought him to the edge of acknowledging his feelings openly before pulling back for comedic effect. MacFarlane described Stewie in one season's commentary as a very unhappy, repressed heterosexual in one context and treated the question as genuinely open in others. The ambiguity became a running thread. None of this was inherently wrong as a creative direction. A character exploring a new dimension of themselves can be genuinely interesting, and some of the episodes built around this version of Stewie, particularly the later seasons of the Brian and Stewie dynamic, produced real moments of warmth and even genuine emotion. The Season 8 bottle episode Brian and Stewie, which locked both characters in a bank vault over a weekend with no other characters present and no cutaway gags at all, is one of the most tonally unusual episodes in the show's history. The 2 characters simply talk. They argue. They acknowledge what they mean to each other. It works because it takes both characters seriously as people rather than as joke machines. But what was lost in this transition was irreplaceable. The original Stewie was the show's most purely original creation, a character that existed nowhere else in any form, doing something no animated character had ever done before. The later Stewie, while often funny and occasionally touching, was a character type that existed in many other places. A flamboyant, quick-witted, slightly chaotic scene stealer with ambiguous sexuality. That character exists across dozens of shows. The evil genius baby who wanted to end his mother's existence and had built the weapons to attempt it existed only here. MacFarlane himself has compared the original Stewie to Wile E. Coyote from the old Looney Tunes cartoons, a character defined by the endless, committed, always failing pursuit of a single goal. The comparison is apt, and it points directly at what the change cost. Wile E. Coyote works because he never stops chasing the Roadrunner. The moment he caught the Roadrunner and had to figure out what to do next, the character would cease to exist in any meaningful sense. Stewie's original premise worked the same way. The moment the show decided he had outgrown trying to kill Lois, it had to replace that premise with something else. What it replaced it with was smaller, warmer, and fundamentally less original. The character that emerged from this transition was still voiced by MacFarlane with great skill, still capable of brilliant individual moments, still the center of some of the show's best later episodes. But the transformation from the character who had won Emmy Awards and been named one of television's greatest villains into Brian's excitable companion represented something the show never acknowledged directly: the quiet retirement of its most irreplaceable creative achievement, traded for something safer and easier to sustain over 20-plus seasons of television. Stewie's original premise had a natural ending built into it. Either he kills Lois, or he doesn't, and keeps trying. The show chose neither. It chose a third path that avoided the ending entirely by making the character into something different, someone for whom killing Lois was no longer really the point. That choice kept Stewie on screen for 2 more decades. It also meant the character on screen was no longer quite the one that had earned all those awards and all that genuine love. What happened to Stewie was a product of the same forces that had reshaped Peter. The pressure to keep a long-running show fresh, the gradual drift away from original intentions, the slow replacement of specific creative choices with broader and more sustainable ones. But Stewie's case was sharper and more visible than Peter's, because what was lost was more clearly defined. With Peter, the argument is about degree. He became worse, meaner, less human. With Stewie, the argument is about identity. The character that made the show genuinely special was replaced, piece by piece, with a different character wearing the same football-shaped head. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Both of these transformations, Peter's collapse into pure cruelty, Stewie's drift into comfortable sidekick territory, were driven in significant part by a third force that the show had never fully reckoned with. A force that started as one of the show's greatest creative tools and slowly became one of its most damaging habits: the cutaway gag. Section 7. The cutaway problem, from punchline to replacement for writing. Every great comedy tool has a version of itself that stops being a tool and starts being a crutch. For Family Guy, that tool was the cutaway gag. And the story of how one of the most creative comedic inventions in animated television history became the single most criticized thing about the show is a story about what happens when something works so well that the people using it stop asking whether it is working and just keep using it. The cutaway gag in its original form was elegant. A character would say something, reference a memory, make a comparison, describe something that happened, and the show would immediately cut to a short visual sequence showing that thing before returning to the scene exactly where it left off. The interruption was the joke. The return was the reassurance that the main story was still happening. Done well, it felt like the best kind of digression: brief, sharp, and worth the detour. What made the early cutaway gags work was a quality that is easy to name, but hard to manufacture. They were observational. They came from a real place. They took something recognizable, a shared cultural memory, a common human experience, a specific feeling that everyone has had, but nobody has put into words quite like that, and exaggerated it just enough to be funny without losing the thread of recognition that made the audience feel seen. The joke was not just the image on screen. The joke was the connection between the image on screen and something the audience already carried in their heads. When that connection fired, the laugh was immediate and genuine because it came from somewhere true. Road to Rhode Island is a useful example of how the early cutaways function. The episode has cutaway gags. It is Family Guy. It always has cutaway gags, but they sit inside a story that is moving with genuine momentum. Brian's background is being revealed. Stewie and Brian's friendship is being built in real time. The cutaways are present, but the story does not need them to keep going. They are additions, not foundations. Compare that to the Conway Twitty gag. Conway Twitty was an American country music singer who was popular in the 1970s and 1980s. Starting in season 7, Family Guy began using a recurring gag in which an episode would abruptly cut to a full performance of a Conway Twitty song, running for multiple minutes before returning to the story. The first instance of this appeared in the season 7 episode, The Juice is Loose. The Twitty segment ran for approximately 3 minutes. There was no joke embedded in the performance itself. The joke was purely the fact that the show had stopped to show you something completely disconnected from anything happening in the episode for longer than any reasonable comedy beat should last. The Conway Twitty gag became infamous. It appeared multiple times across different seasons. Some fans found it a bold and funny commitment to the idea of the anti-joke, a gag whose humor came entirely from its refusal to be funny in any conventional sense. Many more found it unwatchable. What it represented, regardless of how individual viewers responded to it, was the cutaway gag taken to its logical extreme. A complete, total, and unapologetic replacement of story with nothing. No punchline, no observation, no connection, just a gap where the show used to be, filled with content that dared you to keep watching. The Conway Twitty gag was unusual enough to be discussed as its own phenomenon, but it was the visible tip of a much larger shift that had been happening across the show's run since the revival. By season 10 and beyond, the ratio of cutaway gags to actual storytelling had changed dramatically from the early seasons. Critics and fans began noticing that episodes were being built in reverse, that the writers were starting with a collection of cutaway ideas and then constructing a loose framework of plot around them. Just enough story to justify moving from one gag to the next. The nominal plots of later episodes often had no real stakes and no real resolution. They existed as connective tissue between disconnected jokes rather than as stories in their own right. This is what Trey Parker and Matt Stone were pointing at when they made their 2006 South Park two-parter Cartoon Wars. Those episodes depicted the Family Guy writing staff as a tank full of manatees who assembled jokes by picking up beach balls labeled with random words, a noun, a verb, a celebrity name, a pop culture reference, and combining them into cutaway gags. The joke was that the writing required no actual thought, that the gags were not built from observation or character or story, but from random assembly. Parker and Stone were explicit in interviews that they genuinely hated Family Guy's approach to comedy, not the show itself. They acknowledged there were smart people working on it and that it clearly connected with a large audience. What they hated was the specific technique. Their argument was that jokes should come from the story and the characters, that they should grow out of something real rather than being parachuted in from nowhere. In their view, a random cutaway gag that had no connection to what was happening in the episode was not actually a joke. It was a placeholder shaped like a joke. MacFarlane, when asked about the South Park parody in a 2012 interview with Rolling Stone, said he thought it was funny and accurate. That is a significant admission from a creator about his own show. He also said he did not fully understand the personal hostility from Parker and Stone, and that he felt the South Park approach to comedy was not the only valid one. Both of those things can be true simultaneously. The manatee critique can be accurate, and the show can still be doing something that works for its audience. But accurate it was. What followed the Cartoon Wars episode was revealing in its own way. The Family Guy writers began referring to their own random cutaway gags as manatee jokes in the DVD commentaries for subsequent seasons. They had absorbed the criticism, named it, and continued. The self-awareness was real. The behavior did not change. If anything, the volume of random cutaway gags in later seasons increased rather than decreased, as if the show had decided that since it had been labeled as a machine for producing them, it might as well lean into the label. The Simpsons writing staff, according to Parker and Stone, sent flowers to South Park after Cartoon Wars aired. The King of the Hill writing staff reached out to say that Parker and Stone were doing God's work. Parker said in the DVD commentary for the episode that the writers of The Simpsons hated Family Guy more than South Park did, though they would not say so publicly. These were not isolated opinions from rival shows being petty. They were the reactions of comedy writers who understood the craft and recognized something that bothered them professionally: the successful packaging of randomness as comedy, the industrialization of the joke. The cutaway problem connected directly to the character problems discussed in earlier sections. When an episode is built around a series of disconnected gags, rather than around a genuine story with genuine stakes, the characters in that episode cannot grow or change because there is nothing for them to grow or change through. They show up, say the thing that sets up the cutaway, wait for the cutaway to end, and continue. Their personality in a given episode is whatever the gag requires it to be, rather than whatever their established character would honestly produce. This is why Peter could be a cruel and senseless bully in one episode and then back to something resembling a functional father in the next. The episodes did not talk to each other. Each one was a standalone gag delivery system, and consistency was not the point. The audience's response to the cutaway problem was well documented and specific. Fan communities and critics both began distinguishing sharply between the show's early approach to cutaway gags, purposeful, observational, brief, and its later approach, random, extended, sometimes running for minutes with no apparent payoff. The Conway-Twitty segments became the symbol of this because they were so extreme. But the same quality existed throughout later seasons in less dramatic form. Cutaways that went on 30 seconds past the point where they were funny. Cutaways that had no discernible connection to anything in the episode. Cutaways that were offensive without being insightful, relying on shock alone rather than the shock plus recognition that had made early Family Guy controversial in productive ways. The show was aware of all of this. In a later season, Family Guy produced an episode called Cutaway Land, in which Peter and Lois gained the ability to travel between cutaway gags as if they were physical places. The episode was the show's attempt to be meta and self-aware about its own most criticized feature. The response from fans was largely negative, not because the premise was wrong, but because the episode itself relied on recycled cutaways from earlier episodes, which managed to be simultaneously a commentary on the problem and a demonstration of it. The show was smart enough to notice what it had become. It was too embedded in what it had become to do anything differently. MacFarlane himself has spoken about the production cycle as a factor in this dynamic. The 12 to 14-month gap between a joke being written and that joke reaching an audience is a genuine creative challenge. A topical gag about something in the news might be completely dated by the time the episode airs. The cutaway gag format, which could draw on timeless cultural references and universal human experiences rather than specific current events, was a practical solution to that problem. It was genuinely well suited to the show's production reality. The issue was not that the format was wrong for Family Guy. The issue was that the format had expanded over 2 decades of production from a clever tool used in service of stories into the primary substance of the show itself. What the cutaway had replaced by the later seasons was not just story. It had replaced the thing that made story matter in the first place: consequence. When a show cuts away from a scene at the moment when a character would have to feel something real and returns to that scene after the moment has passed, it trains its audience not to expect feeling from it. Do that enough times across enough seasons, and the audience stops waiting for the feeling. They start waiting for the next cutaway instead. That training, the gradual replacement of emotional expectation with the expectation of disconnected jokes, is one of the most significant things the later seasons did to Family Guy's relationship with its audience. And it did not happen in isolation. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Because around the same time the cutaway problem was becoming undeniable, Seth MacFarlane was building something much larger than a television show. Something that would pull his attention, his energy, and his creative instincts in so many different directions that Family Guy would never fully have him back. Section 8. The Seth MacFarlane Empire: How Spreading Thin Diluted Everything. There is a specific kind of problem that only success can create. When you have nothing, every decision is simple. You make the thing you want to make with whatever you have available, and the only question is whether it is good enough. When you have everything, money, opportunity, the trust of a major network, a proven audience of millions, and a contract worth 100 million, the decisions multiply in every direction. Every door that was closed is now open. Every project that was previously impossible is suddenly feasible. Every idea you have ever had is now worth pursuing because you have the resources to pursue it. Seth MacFarlane reached that position in the years following Family Guy's revival, and what he did with it was completely understandable, genuinely impressive in many ways, and deeply damaging to the show that had made it all possible. The scale of what MacFarlane was managing by the late 2000s is worth laying out in specific terms because the numbers tell a story that is easy to miss when you are just watching episodes. Family Guy was still in production and required his voice for 4 main characters in every single episode: Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire. Each of those performances needed to be recorded, reviewed, and matched to the animation. American Dad, which he had co-created in 2005, required him to voice both Stan Smith and Roger the Alien, 2 of the show's most prominent characters, across every episode of its run. The Cleveland show launched in 2009, and while MacFarlane's acting role there was smaller, he voiced a supporting character called Tim the Bear for the first 2 seasons before stepping away from that role entirely. He was still listed as a creator and held executive producer responsibilities across all 3 shows simultaneously. 3 animated primetime television shows running at the same time on the same network. Beyond the 3 shows, MacFarlane was developing his film career in a serious and committed way. Ted, which he wrote, directed, and starred in as the voice of the central character, was released in 2012. The film grossed over $500 million worldwide on a budget of approximately $50 million. It was, by any measure, a massive commercial success and proof that MacFarlane could translate his comedic voice into a different medium at the highest level. A sequel, Ted 2, followed in 2015. He also wrote, directed, and starred in A Million Ways to Die in the West in 2014. In 2013, he hosted the 85th Academy Awards ceremony. This is one of the most watched television events in the world. Preparing to host it, performing in it, and managing the public attention that followed required significant time and energy, regardless of whatever else was happening in his professional life. He released his first jazz album, Music is Better Than Words, in 2011. It was nominated for a Grammy Award for Best Traditional Pop Vocal Album at the 54th Grammy Awards in 2012. He followed it with multiple additional albums over the following years and performed as a live singer at Carnegie Hall in New York, the Royal Albert Hall in London, and the BBC Proms. These were not casual side projects. They were serious musical commitments at serious venues that required genuine preparation and performance. He served as executive producer on Cosmos, a Space-Time Odyssey, the science documentary series hosted by Neil deGrasse Tyson that aired in 2014. MacFarlane had been instrumental in getting that series made, using his industry position to secure studio support and funding for a project that would otherwise have struggled to find a home on mainstream television. And then there was The Orville, his science fiction drama series that premiered in 2017, which he created, starred in, and was deeply personally invested in. The Orville was not a comedy side project. It was a serious, expensive, labor-intensive production that MacFarlane has spoken about with more visible passion and emotional investment than almost anything else in his career. All of this was happening while Family Guy was still in production. While the characters MacFarlane had created in his kitchen at 23 were still appearing on screen every week, still speaking in his voice, still living in the world he had built, the show never stopped. MacFarlane never stopped. But the portion of his attention, his creativity, and his genuine daily presence that Family Guy was receiving was shrinking with every new project he took on. The moment that crystallizes this most sharply is the one already discussed, his 2017 Reddit session, where he confirmed he had not written a single Family Guy episode since 2010. That means that from 2010 onwards, every episode of Family Guy that aired, every story, every joke, every character decision, was made without the person whose instincts had built the show from nothing. MacFarlane was still voicing Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire. His voice was in every scene, but his pen had been elsewhere for years. American Dad shows what Family Guy lost when MacFarlane stepped back, and it does so by demonstrating what a show gains when it is given genuine creative freedom from the person who created it. MacFarlane has said openly that he found American Dad difficult to connect with in its early seasons. The show had been built partly as a political satire during the George W. Bush era. And when that specific political moment passed, the show needed to find a new identity. What happened next was that MacFarlane largely handed the show to his co-creators, Mike Barker and Matt Weitzman, who took it in a direction that was stranger, more committed, and more creatively adventurous than anything Family Guy had attempted since its own golden age. The characters in American Dad grew and changed in ways that Family Guy's characters had stopped doing. Roger the Alien, who had started as a fairly simple comedic presence, became one of the most genuinely unpredictable and creative characters in adult animation, an alien who could adopt unlimited human personas and whose episodes could go in any direction from any starting point. Stan Smith, who had begun as a broad satire of a certain kind of patriotic American man, developed genuine emotional complexity over time. The show took real risks with format and tone in ways that frequently surprised its audience. By the early 2010s, a clear critical consensus had emerged. American Dad was the better show. More consistent, more daring, more willing to follow an idea all the way to its logical conclusion without flinching. Critics who had spent years treating it as Family Guy's lesser sibling were now writing pieces arguing that it had surpassed its parent program in every meaningful creative dimension. The reason for this reversal was not complicated. American Dad was better because the person who had created it had stepped back far enough to let it breathe. Family Guy was struggling because the show's identity was so completely tied to MacFarlane, to his voice, his characters, his reputation, that nobody in the writer's room could fully own it in the way Barker and Weitzman owned American Dad. Family Guy was still Seth MacFarlane's show in every public and commercial sense, but Seth MacFarlane was somewhere else, making films and albums and science documentaries and a space drama. And the show that bore his name was being maintained rather than driven. The Cleveland show illustrated a different aspect of the same problem. The spin-off, which followed Cleveland Brown after he left Quahog to start a new life in Virginia, ran from 2009 to 2013 and was canceled after 4 seasons due to poor ratings. MacFarlane's involvement was minimal from the beginning. The show never developed a clear identity of its own, and critics noted that its strongest moments were consistently the ones involving crossover appearances from Family Guy characters. The spin-off's best scenes were scenes from the parent show visiting briefly. What that said about the McFarlane empire was uncomfortable but honest. The creative energy that made Family Guy great did not transfer. It was not a formula that could be extracted and applied elsewhere. It had come from a specific combination of circumstances, a specific creator in a specific moment of hunger and desperation, making something with nothing and having to make it good because there was no other option. That combination could not be packaged and sent to Virginia with Cleveland Brown. McFarlane himself has reflected on this with a kind of clarity that is more candid than most television creators manage. In an interview with The Zach Sang Show, he spoke about the extraordinary luck involved in Family Guy's original success, that he had been 24 years old at exactly the moment when Fox was looking for exactly the kind of show he had made, that the timing had been perfect in ways that had nothing to do with his talent or preparation. He said that if he were pitching Family Guy today, in the current television environment, he was not confident he would be able to sell it. That honesty is worth sitting with. The person who created Family Guy does not believe he could create it again. The conditions that produced it, the specific cultural moment, the specific network hunger, the specific personal circumstances of a sleep-deprived art school graduate drawing in his kitchen, were unrepeatable. And the person who had lived through those conditions had, by his own account, been going at a dead run since the show premiered in 1999 without ever really stopping. In a 2024 interview with The Wrap, McFarlane described his experience of the show's 25-year run by saying it had felt like one very long day. He said there were now episodes he could not remember making, that he would go back and watch something from a previous season and have only a vague sense of having been involved in its creation. 25 years of production, over 400 episodes, and the person at the center of it had been moving so fast and doing so many other things that whole pieces of the work had passed through his hands without leaving a clear impression. That is what an empire costs. Not in money, which McFarlane clearly has in abundance, but in attention, in presence, in the kind of slow, careful, specific creative focus that had built the golden age episode by episode in the years when Family Guy was all there was. The empire kept growing, the shows kept airing, the merchandise kept selling. And back in Quahog, the characters that McFarlane had built with such care and precision were being written by a room full of talented professionals who were doing their best with the material they had inherited. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But what those writers inherited was a cast that had already undergone significant changes from their original forms. And as the writers' room worked through season after season, without the show's creator at the table, those changes accelerated across every character in the ensemble. Not just Peter, not just Stewie, every single one of them. Section 9. The Flanderization of everyone when characters became caricatures. There is a term that television fans use to describe what happens when a character loses everything that made them interesting and gets reduced to a single repeated trait played louder and louder until there is nothing else left. The term is Flanderization. It comes from The Simpsons. Ned Flanders, the Griffin family's neighborly equivalent in Springfield, began the show as a genuinely well-written character, a deeply religious man who was nonetheless warm, patient, and surprisingly human in his occasional frustrations. Over many seasons, everything about him except his religiousness was gradually stripped away until he existed purely as a walking collection of church jokes. The specific human being disappeared. The label remained. Family Guy did this to almost every character it had, and it did it more completely, more quickly, and more visibly than almost any other show in the history of adult animation. The previous sections covered what happened to Peter and Stewie in detail, but the transformation of those two characters did not happen in isolation. It was part of a pattern that ran across the entire cast, driven by the same forces. the pressure of long-term production, the absence of the show's creator from the writing room, the commercial need for characters to remain recognizable rather than genuinely alive, and the natural tendency of comedy writers working under pressure to reach for the biggest, most obvious version of whatever a character was already known for. Brian Griffin is the most instructive case after Peter and Stewie, because what happened to Brian is different in a specific and important way. Peter became crueler. Stewie became softer. Brian became a mouthpiece. In the early seasons, Brian was the show's most quietly complex character. He was a talking dog, which was the absurd premise, but the show played his intelligence and his emotional life completely straight. He drank martinis and read books and spoke in complete, articulate sentences. He was more thoughtful than anyone else in the Griffin house and more aware of his own failings than almost anyone else in the show. He had genuine vulnerabilities, his writing career that never quite took off, his romantic life that never quite worked out, his complicated feelings about his own nature and what it meant to be a dog who thought like a man. None of this was played for cheap laughs. It was just the texture of who he was. Brian also held clear liberal political views, which MacFarlane shared in the early seasons. Those views were present but contained. Brian would occasionally say something that revealed where he stood politically, and the show would move on. The politics were one part of a full character rather than the whole of what he was. After the revival, and increasingly from season 6 onwards, Brian's political views expanded until they consumed him. He became, in the words of critics and longtime fans, a walking lecture. Episodes built around Brian increasingly involved him pushing a political or social position on the other characters, being met with resistance or mockery, and then being proven right in some form. The show was using him as a vehicle for the writer's opinions, rather than as a character with his own independent life. His pretension, which had been a gentle running joke in the early seasons, the dog who thought he was a serious writer, became the dominant note of his personality in later seasons, stripped of the self-awareness and genuine feeling that had made it funny rather than grating. Quagmire's trajectory illustrates yet another version of this same process. Glenn Quagmire began the show as a specific comic creation, a throwback to the lounge lizard culture of the 1950s and 1960s, a man whose approach to women was so extravagantly outdated that it functioned as a kind of time capsule joke. He was funny because he was a relic. His catchphrase, the drawn-out giggity, was delivered with a particular period-specific swagger that placed him in a different era from everyone around him. The joke was cultural, specific, and rooted in a genuine observation about a recognizable type of man. As the seasons progressed, Quagmire's behavior around women escalated steadily beyond what the original character had been built to sustain. The light period comedy quality of his early characterization gave way to something darker and more extreme. Episodes began portraying him in situations that the show presented as comedy, but that many viewers found increasingly difficult to accept in that framing. The cultural joke had been replaced by something that had lost the cultural distance that made the joke possible. Without that distance, what remained was just the behavior itself, played for shock rather than for the specific comedic observation about a certain kind of man from a certain era that had made the character work originally. Meg Griffin's transformation is the one that the show itself explicitly acknowledged, which makes it the most honest and also the most troubling case in the ensemble. In the early seasons, Meg was a recognizable teenage girl. She wanted to be popular. She had crushes on boys who did not notice her. She was embarrassed by her parents. She talked too much about things her peers did not care about. She was not a rich or deeply developed character, but she was human in all the ordinary ways that matter. The writing staff, predominantly male throughout the show's run, found Meg difficult to write with genuine insight. Rather than solving this problem creatively, they resolved it operationally. They made Meg the family's designated target, the character whose purpose was to be rejected, humiliated, and dismissed by everyone around her. This happened gradually across seasons 3 through 6, and then became essentially total from season 8 onwards. Meg existed, in practical terms, to receive abuse from the people who were supposed to love her, and to provide a contrast that made everyone else seem marginally less awful by comparison. The season 10 episode Seahorse Seashell Party is the moment the show was most honest about what it had done to her. In that episode, Meg finally reaches her limit and confronts her family with a clear and detailed account of how they treat her. Her speech is not played as comedy. It is played straight, and it is effective precisely because everything she says is accurate. She describes Peter's cruelty, Lois's indifference, Chris's casual meanness. The family, deprived of their usual target, begins falling apart. They turn on each other. They have a collective breakdown because without Meg absorbing everything, they have no way to function. The episode ends with Meg deciding to continue absorbing it, accepting her role as the family's lightning rod because she has concluded that keeping them together requires someone to take the damage. It is genuinely one of the more emotionally considered pieces of writing in the show's later run. And then the next episode aired, and everything was exactly as it had always been. That is the pattern with all of these characters. The show demonstrated repeatedly that it understood what it was doing. Seahorse Seashell Party proved the writers could see Meg's situation clearly. The season 8 episode Jerome Is the New Black contained a long speech from Quagmire to Brian that was one of the most precisely observed pieces of character writing in the show's post-revival run. Quagmire itemizing in specific and accurate detail exactly why Brian had become insufferable. The speech worked because it was true. Everything Quagmire accused Brian of being, Brian had in fact become. The show knew. The writers knew. They wrote the awareness directly into the script. And then Brian continued being exactly what Quagmire had accused him of being for the rest of the show's run. This gap between knowing what had happened to the characters and continuing to do it anyway is one of the most specific features of Family Guy's later seasons. The show had developed a habit of self-awareness that it used as a substitute for self-correction. By acknowledging the problem in the text of the show, the writers seemed to feel they had addressed it. Naming the thing replaced fixing the thing. The audience was meant to appreciate the honesty of the observation without holding the show accountable for continuing the behavior that was being observed. Joe Swanson, the wheelchair-bound police officer who had been one of the show's most reliable supporting characters in the early seasons, went through a version of this same process. In the early seasons, Joe was played with a specific dignity that made him both funny and genuinely sympathetic. He was a man who had lost the use of his legs and responded to that loss with determination rather than despair. His disability was part of who he was without being the whole of who he was. He was a good police officer, a devoted, if complicated husband, and a loyal friend. From around season 8 through season 10, the show began using Joe's disability primarily as a source of crude jokes, stripping away the dignity that had made the character work and replacing it with something that several critics described as mean-spirited rather than satirical. Carter Pewterschmidt, Lois's wealthy father, underwent a parallel collapse. In the early seasons, Carter was a genuinely funny character precisely because he was so specific. He was an old-money businessman with deeply held prejudices and a complete inability to understand why his daughter had chosen a man like Peter. His dislike of Peter was rooted in class snobbery that the show portrayed with a light satirical touch. He was wrong about Peter, clearly, but his wrongness came from a recognizable place. In later seasons, Carter's behavior became increasingly erratic and cartoonishly villainous in ways that had no connection to the carefully drawn character from the early run. What is striking about all of these cases, when you look at them together, is how consistent the pattern is. Every character in Family Guy's ensemble lost their specific human qualities and gained a louder, simpler, more extreme version of their most obvious defining feature. The process was not identical for every character. Some lost nuance, some gained cruelty, some were simply forgotten. But the direction was the same across the board. The reason for this consistency is that it was driven by the same underlying cause in every case. A writer's room producing content under pressure without the guiding creative presence of the show's creator, for an audience that had come to expect a specific version of each character and would notice and object to significant departures. The path of least resistance in that situation is to give each character more of what they are already known for. More of Peter's stupidity, more of Brian's lectures, more of Quagmire's behavior, more of Meg's suffering, more, until more was all there was. The Golden Age characters had been specific, the later season characters were types, and the distance between a specific person and a type is exactly the distance between a show that feels alive and a show that feels like it is running on habit. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. All of these character changes, every single one of them, were made worse by one additional force that had been quietly reshaping the show's relationship with its audience since the mid-2000s. A force that came not from inside the writer's room, but from a decision to treat a beloved character's death as a marketing event. Section 10. Life of Brian, the day the show openly became a stunt machine. There are moments in a television show's life that function like a mirror. Not a flattering mirror. The kind that shows you something about yourself that you have been avoiding looking at directly. The kind that forces a question you would rather not answer. For Family Guy, that moment came on November 24th, 2013, when Season 12, Episode 6 aired on Fox. The episode was called Life of Brian, and what it did to the show's relationship with its audience was something that no amount of subsequent good episodes could fully undo. To understand why Life of Brian mattered so much, you need to understand what Brian Griffin had meant to Family Guy across its first 12 seasons. Brian was not just a character, he was the show's emotional anchor. From the very beginning, he had been the point of stability around which everything else rotated. Peter was chaos, Stewie was menace, then later eccentricity. The rest of the family existed in various states of comedy-driven dysfunction. Brian was the one who observed all of it with a kind of sad, clear-eyed intelligence. He was the one who could be honest with Peter in ways nobody else could. He was the one whose relationship with Stewie gave the show some of its most genuinely felt moments. He was the character through whom the show most consistently attempted something resembling emotional truth. His relationship with Stewie, built across years of road to episodes and smaller moments scattered through dozens of other installments, was the single most developed relationship in the entire show. By Season 8's bottle episode, Brian and Stewie, where both characters were locked in a bank vault over a weekend with no other characters and no cutaway gags, that relationship had reached a level of genuine depth that almost nothing else in Family Guy had managed to achieve. The episode was quiet and strange and uncommonly honest about loneliness and connection, and it worked because both characters had been built carefully enough over many years that the audience genuinely cared what happened between them. That is the weight that Life of Brian was carrying when it aired. The setup of the episode is relatively simple. Stewie destroys his time machine early in the episode to prevent the recurring problem of their time travel adventures causing chaos. A short time later, while Stewie has gone back inside the house to retrieve his knee pads, Brian is struck by a car in the street. He is rushed to the veterinarian. He does not recover. Brian Griffin dies in the Season 12 episode of Family Guy, surrounded by the Griffin family, his last words being that he loves them all. The family holds a funeral. They grieve, and within days, Peter goes to a pet shop and comes home with a new dog. an Italian-American smooth talker named Vinny, voiced by Tony Sirico, best known as Paulie Walnuts from The Sopranos. Vinny moves into the Griffin house. The family begins adjusting to life without Brian. The episode ends. The reaction from the audience was immediate, enormous, and genuinely angry in a way that surprised even the people who had made the decision. A petition on change.org demanding that Brian be brought back gathered over 100,000 signatures within the first 72 hours of the episode airing. Facebook memorial pages dedicated to Brian Griffin accumulated hundreds of thousands of followers within days. Some fans were so convinced Brian would not really stay dead that a website appeared with a countdown clock supposedly counting down to a special announcement from Brian, though Fox quickly confirmed it had nothing to do with the show. Fans who had grown up watching Family Guy, who had watched Brian and Stewie's friendship develop across more than a decade of episodes, were genuinely devastated in the way that you are devastated when something you have invested real feeling in is taken away suddenly and without warning. Executive producer Steve Callahan gave an interview to the entertainment news outlet E! Explaining the decision. He said the death had been pitched in the writer's room, that it had caught fire as an idea, and that he and the other producers had gotten very excited about exploring how the change would affect the family's dynamics. He described it as a fun way to shake things up. Fun. That word landed badly. MacFarlane, speaking to reporters at a Television Critics Association press event shortly after the episode aired, offered his own explanation. He said the team had been surprised by the intensity of the audience's reaction. He said they had expected the death to create a stir, but that the rage was something they had not counted on. Then, he said something that revealed the actual thinking behind the decision more clearly than perhaps he intended. He said the move had done what it was designed to do. It had reminded people that Family Guy was still a show where anything could happen. That even after all these years, the show still had the ability to surprise. That explanation is worth reading carefully because of what it admits. The death of Brian Griffin was designed. It was a deliberate strategy to generate attention and remind the audience that the show was still capable of shocking them. It was not driven by a story that needed to be told or a character arc that had reached its natural conclusion. It was a tool for creating buzz at a moment when the show's ratings had been declining. According to a student newspaper report at the time, viewership had dropped by approximately 21% in the period leading up to the episode, and the producers had been looking for ways to bring attention back to the show. 3 episodes after Brian's death, in the season 12 Christmas special titled Christmas Guy, Stewie encountered an alternate timeline version of himself in a toy store. That alternate Stewie still had a functioning time machine. Present-day Stewie, who had destroyed his own machine at the start of Life of Brian, borrowed it and traveled back in time to the moment of Brian's accident. He pushed Brian out of the way of the oncoming car. Brian did not die. The timeline was restored. Everything was as it had been. MacFarlane tweeted after Christmas Guy aired, "And thus endeth our warm, fuzzy holiday lesson. Never take those you love for granted, for they can be gone in a flash." The audience had been through 3 weeks of genuine grief over a fictional character, and the show had resolved it with a time travel reset and a lesson about appreciating the people in your life. Brian was back. The stunt was over. The ratings had been discussed. Everyone could move on. The critical response to the whole arc was sharp and specific. Many longtime viewers and critics did not object to the idea of a major character dying. That kind of bold storytelling, done honestly, can be one of the most powerful things a long-running show can attempt. What they objected to was the combination of factors that surrounded the decision. The death had come abruptly, without the kind of storytelling groundwork that would have given it genuine weight. Brian had been run over by a car while Stewie went to get his knee pads. There was no narrative build toward the moment. There was no sense that this ending was the honest conclusion to something the show had been exploring. It was simply a sudden event designed to produce a specific emotional reaction in the audience. The reversal 3 episodes later confirmed what many had suspected from the beginning. The show had never intended to live with the consequences of what it had done. Brian was always coming back. The grief the audience had experienced was the point, not as the foundation for genuine storytelling, but as evidence that the audience still cared enough to react. MacFarlane himself said as much when he expressed surprise and satisfaction at how angry people got. The anger had proved something useful. It had proved the show still had the ability to make people feel things strongly. The problem was the relationship between the feeling and the purpose it was serving. In the early seasons of Family Guy, the show made the audience feel things because it was telling stories about people they had come to care about. The feeling was the natural result of good storytelling. In Life of Brian, the show made the audience feel things as a deliberate strategy for generating attention and demonstrating continued relevance. The feeling was the product being manufactured rather than the outcome of genuine creative work. Those are two fundamentally different relationships between a show and its audience, and the audience felt the difference, even if they could not always articulate exactly what it was. What Life of Brian did to the show's credibility was permanent in a specific way. Before that episode, Family Guy's audience could watch the show with a basic faith that the creative decisions being made were driven by some version of genuine artistic intent, however loosely defined. After it, that faith had a visible crack running through it. Every subsequent storyline that carried emotional stakes, every episode that asked the audience to invest in something the show seemed to be treating seriously, carried the memory of Life of Brian with it. The audience had learned that the show was capable of weaponizing their emotional investment for commercial purposes, and that knowledge changed how they watched everything that came after. Vinny, the replacement dog, voiced by Tony Sirico, was criticized widely. Italian-American groups objected to the characterization. Fans who had lost Brian found Vinny's presence in the Griffin house genuinely difficult to accept. Not because Sirico's performance was poor, but because the entire premise of Vinny's existence was the result of a decision the audience knew had been made cynically. When Stewie brought Brian back, Vinny was erased from the timeline. The show briefly acknowledged Vinny's fate with a moment that tried to give him a dignified exit. Most viewers had stopped caring. The Life of Brian arc did something else that is worth noting. The original Family Guy, the Golden Age show that this video has been examining, would have made a joke about exactly this kind of stunt. The early seasons were full of moments where the show broke the fourth wall to comment on the cynical mechanics of the television industry. Peter's Season 4 speech listing all of Fox's canceled shows was that kind of joke. The show had always been smart enough to see what networks and producers did to generate attention, and sharp enough to call it out. By Season 12, Family Guy was the thing it had once made jokes about. The show that had been canceled twice and brought back by fans had become a machine generating the exact kind of manipulative emotional stunts that a younger, hungrier version of itself would have found material for a great cutaway gag. That distance between what the show had been and what it had become is precisely what the final sections of this video are about. Because Life of Brian was not an isolated decision. It was the clearest expression of something that had been building across years of production, across the empire, across the character changes, across the cutaway problem. It was the moment the machine showed its face most openly. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And to understand how a show that had been made with such genuine creative hunger ended up in that position, you have to go back to the very beginning one more time. Back to the conditions that made the Golden Age possible, and to the specific, painful irony at the heart of everything Family Guy became. Section 11. The Golden Age was forged by failure. Why adversity made the show great. There is a thing that happens to creative people when they have nothing left to lose. It is not comfortable. It does not feel good while it is happening. But something about that specific condition, the condition of having already failed, of having already been told no, of having nothing left to protect, produces a quality of work that comfort almost never can. The pressure is different when failure has already happened. When you have already lost, the fear of losing stops running the decisions. And when the fear of losing stops running the decisions, something else gets to run them instead. Something closer to honesty, something closer to instinct, something that does not calculate how the audience will react before committing to the choice. Family Guy's golden age was built entirely inside that condition. Seth MacFarlane was 24 years old when Fox gave him a television show. He was the youngest executive producer of a prime-time animated series in the history of American television. He had come from Rhode Island School of Design. He had made a short film called The Life of Larry, and then a follow-up called Larry and Steve that had caught the attention of people at Fox. The network gave him a budget of $50,000 to develop a pilot. He worked on that pilot for 11 months, reportedly nearly dying in a car accident during the production period before completing it. Fox ordered the show. It debuted immediately after the Super Bowl in January 1999 to 22 million viewers. And then almost everything went wrong. The network moved the show repeatedly. It placed it against Frasier on Thursday nights, then against Who Wants to Be a Millionaire on Tuesday nights. The ratings collapsed. The show fell to 114th in the national rankings, with approximately 6.3 million households watching. Fox canceled it in May 2000. MacFarlane was 26 years old, and his television show was over. Fox brought it back for a third season, then canceled it again in 2002, this time with one episode left unaired. That second cancellation was quieter and, in some ways, harder. The first cancellation had felt like a scheduling problem, an external force working against the show. The second felt more final. The show had been given a second chance, and the numbers had not improved enough to justify continuing. MacFarlane was 28 years old, and his television show had now been canceled twice. What happened during those years of cancellation and uncertainty is what this section is about, because the writing staff that produced the episodes that critics and fans still consider the best Family Guy ever made, Band Geeks, Road to Rhode Island, Peter Griffin, Husband, Father, Brother, the bulk of seasons 2, 3, and 4 produced those episodes under conditions of total instability. They did not know if the show would survive. They did not know if they would have jobs. MacFarlane himself said years later that the cancellations meant the show was always having to restaff its writers, constantly bringing in fresh voices and new perspectives, because each cancellation cleared out the room, and each renewal required rebuilding it. That constant restaffing, which at the time felt like damage, was functioning as a gift. A writer's room that has been together for many years tends to develop patterns. The same approaches get used. The same kinds of jokes get made. The people in the room know each other well enough that they can anticipate what will land and what will not, which means the more unexpected and uncomfortable choices get smoothed out before they can fully develop. Familiarity produces competence, but it can also produce a kind of creative comfort that stops pushing against its own edges. The Family Guy writer's room during the Golden Age never had time to develop that comfort. New people kept arriving. Old people kept leaving. The room was always in some state of reconstruction, and new people in a writer's room bring things that established rooms tend to lose. Genuine surprise at what they are allowed to do. Willingness to try approaches the veterans would have quietly talked themselves out of. A lack of institutional memory about what has not worked before. Band Geeks was written by Mark Henteman. Road to Rhode Island was written by Gary Janetti. These were not people writing from years of accumulated caution. They were people writing with a specific freedom that comes from not yet knowing exactly where all the edges are. MacFarlane also made a specific observation about the hiatus period between the second cancellation and the revival that is worth examining carefully. He said that the time away from the show had prevented the writing staff from becoming what he called fatigued, people whose brains were just fried from producing the same material week after week without a break. The cancellation that felt like a death sentence had functioned, in practice, as a forced rest that the show would never have taken on its own. A successful show does not stop. The network does not allow it. The production machine does not allow it. When Family Guy was canceled, the machine stopped. And when it came back, the people making it had recovered something that continuous production quietly drains away. The uncertainty of those years also kept MacFarlane himself working at a specific level of investment that success would later make difficult to sustain. He was not yet rich. He was not yet famous beyond the television industry. He had a show that had failed twice, and that had been given a third chance by circumstances nobody had predicted. He was present in the writer's room. He was writing. He was making decisions about the show with the full weight of his attention and the full force of his creative identity, because the show was still the primary place where his identity lived. There was no film career to maintain. There were no musical ambitions pulling at his schedule. There was no empire. There was Family Guy. And the specific hunger of a person who has been told twice that the thing they made is not good enough and is trying to prove that judgment wrong. The revival season, Season 4, beginning with North by North Quahog in May 2005, was made with a specific intention that MacFarlane later described. He said the writing staff had tried to keep the show exactly as it had been before the cancellation. They were not trying to reinvent it or update it for a new audience. They were trying to give back, as faithfully as possible, the show that the fans had petitioned to save. That intention, the deep, careful respect for what the show had been, was itself a product of the failure years. You only try that hard to preserve something when you understand from direct experience what it feels like to lose it. The contrast with what came later is exact and measurable. After the $100 million deal in 2008, after MacFarlane stopped writing the show in 2010, after the empire expanded to the point where Family Guy was one of several large machines running simultaneously, the conditions that had produced the golden age no longer existed. There was no financial uncertainty. MacFarlane's net worth had reached approximately $400 million. There was no fear of cancellation. The show was generating $100 million a year in merchandise revenue alone, in addition to its syndication and DVD income. There was no forced restaffing of the writer's room by external circumstances. The room had stabilized into a group of professionals producing content reliably and competently within parameters that had been established years earlier. Competence within established parameters is not the same thing as hunger. The show knew this about itself. MacFarlane said in a 2024 interview with the Los Angeles Times that there had been a time when he thought it was time to wrap things up. He used the phrase escape velocity to describe what the show had achieved, a point at which it had enough momentum and enough institutional presence that it no longer needed a strong creative reason to continue. It continued because it was continuing, because the machine was running, because there was no reason significant enough to stop it. That is the precise opposite of the conditions that made the Golden Age possible. The Golden Age was made by people who had every reason to stop and kept going anyway. The later seasons were made by people who had no reason to stop and kept going, because stopping would have required a decision that nobody was positioned or motivated to make. Those two versions of persistence look the same from the outside. The show is on television. New episodes are airing. The characters are doing things and saying things and going on adventures. But the internal reality of those two versions of persistence is completely different, and the difference shows up in the work in ways that the audience registers even when they cannot explain exactly what they are feeling. What Band Geeks has that later episodes do not have is not better jokes, though the jokes are better. It is not better voice performances, though the performances are good. It is the feeling that the people who made it were making it with something at stake. The final musical number, the montage of Quahog citizens performing and the Griffin family watching, and Peter's expression in that moment, it has the quality of work made by people who were not certain they would get to make more of it. The care is visible. The investment is audible. You can feel, watching it, that the people who made it genuinely needed it to be good. That need, the specific creative need produced by uncertainty and hunger and the knowledge that failure is a real possibility, is not something success can replicate. Success removes the need. It replaces it with expectation, with obligation, with the professional requirement to produce content that meets a standard that has already been established. Those are not nothing. Professional obligation produces competent work, but it does not produce band geeks. The tragedy at the center of Family Guy's story is not that the show got worse. Many shows get worse over time. The tragedy is that the thing that made the show great was the same thing that success had to destroy. The hunger required poverty. The creative risk required uncertainty. The McFarlane who wrote from genuine desperation required a McFarlane who had not yet succeeded. Once the show saved itself, once the fans brought it back, once Fox signed the deal, and the merchandise revenue arrived, and the empire began to build, the conditions were gone. The show kept going, but the thing that had made it extraordinary was over. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What that means for the show's legacy, for what Family Guy actually is in total after more than 25 years and more than 450 episodes, is a question that does not have a clean answer, but it is the question that everything in this video has been building toward. Section 12. The legacy, what Family Guy was, what it became, and why it still matters. There is a version of this story that ends with a simple verdict. The show got worse. The creator lost interest. The characters were ruined. The cutaways stopped being funny. The machine took over from the human being and produced something that looked like Family Guy, without being Family Guy in any way that counted. Case closed. Move on. That version of the story is not wrong exactly. Every specific claim in it is supportable. But it is incomplete in a way that matters, because it treats Family Guy as a single thing that failed rather than as two distinct things. One that succeeded at almost everything it attempted, and one that continued existing long after the conditions for that success had disappeared. Family Guy is currently in its 24th season. As of early 2026, the show has produced more than 450 episodes across more than 25 years of television. It is the second longest-running scripted primetime series in American television history, behind only The Simpsons. It is the fourth longest-running scripted primetime series in North American television history. Those are not numbers that a failed show produces. Those are numbers that describe an institution, something that has embedded itself so deeply into the fabric of a culture that it continues generating new versions of itself long past the point where the original creative impulse that started it has run its course. McFarlane said in a 2024 interview with the Los Angeles Times that he no longer sees a good reason to stop. He said, "People still love the show." Both of those things are true in their way. The show still draws an audience. It still generates revenue. It still occupies a place in American comedy culture that almost nothing else has managed to hold for anywhere near as long. But McFarlane also used a phrase in that same period that is more honest about what the show has become than perhaps he intended. He called it escape velocity. The idea is that an object moving fast enough through space reaches a point where gravity can no longer pull it back down. It is not going up because anything is pushing it. It is going because it was going, and nothing has stopped it yet. That is what Family Guy has achieved, in McFarlane's own description of it. Not continued excellence, not renewed creative purpose. escape velocity, momentum that has outlasted the engine that created it. He also said in a 2024 interview with The Wrap that there are episodes of Family Guy he cannot remember making. Not because they were unmemorable in the way that A Quiet Afternoon is unmemorable, but because so many of them were produced across such a long period of time that the individual episodes have blurred together into something he described as one very long day. More than 450 episodes of a television show, produced across 25 years, by a person who stopped writing the show in 2010 and whose attention was divided across films, music, other television shows, and public appearances. That is the show that exists now. And alongside it, preserved in the episodes themselves, unwatchable to change and unchangeable, is the show that existed before. The two things occupy the same space, the same title card, the same theme song, the same characters with the same names, living at the same address, in the same Rhode Island town. But they are not the same show in any way that the people who love Family Guy actually mean when they talk about loving it. When people talk about loving Family Guy, when they bring up the specific episodes, the specific moments, the things the show did that nothing else was doing at the same time, they are almost always talking about the Golden Age. They are talking about Band Geeks. They are talking about Road to Rhode Island. They are talking about Brian and Stewie locked in a bank vault having a conversation about loneliness that had no cutaway gags and no reset button and no easy resolution. They are talking about the Peter Griffin who gave an awkward, genuine speech to his daughter in front of a stadium full of people because he wanted her to know she was good enough. They are talking about the Stewie who was genuinely terrifying and genuinely funny and genuinely unlike anything else on television, the infant who quoted classical literature and built weapons of mass destruction and pursued his mother with a specific operatic hatred that was so committed and so detailed that it became something closer to art than comedy. Those things are real. They happened. They are still there in the episodes available to watch exactly as they were when they first aired. Nothing that came after has removed them. The machine that Family Guy became did not go back and take away what the hungry version of Family Guy had made. What the legacy of Family Guy actually is, in full, is the story of what a specific set of conditions can produce and what the removal of those conditions inevitably costs. MacFarlane was 24, broke by television standards, twice canceled, working with a writer's room that kept turning over, driven by a hunger that only genuine uncertainty can create. Those conditions produced a body of work across 5 seasons that sits comfortably alongside the best work in the history of American animated television. Not adjacent to it, inside it. Band Geeks is not almost a great piece of television. It is a great piece of television. Road to Rhode Island is not almost a perfect episode of comedy. It is a perfect episode of comedy. Those episodes would be extraordinary regardless of when they were made or by whom. The conditions also produced something that was genuinely new. Family Guy arrived at a specific moment in American comedy when the cutaway gag as a structural device had not yet been fully explored. The show took that device and developed it into something with its own internal logic and its own specific pleasures. The best Golden Age cutaways, the ones that worked as actual jokes rather than as time fillers, had a quality that is difficult to describe but immediately recognizable when you encounter it. They were observational in a way that rewarded attention. They assumed the audience was smart enough to make the connection between the setup and the reference without having it explained. They were confident in a way that only work made without fear of failure can be confident, because the people making them had already failed and knew they could survive it. The show also did something that is easy to forget now, but was genuinely significant at the time. It demonstrated that an animated comedy could sustain genuine emotional moments without losing its identity as a comedy. The Simpsons had shown this was possible, but Family Guy showed it was possible in a completely different register, with completely different tools, using a completely different kind of humor. The moment at the end of Band Geeks, when the music swells and the camera holds on the performance and you feel something, that was Family Guy proving it could do something that almost nothing in its genre was doing. Not instead of being funny, while being funny. Those two things at once, held in balance for as long as the conditions allowed. The conditions stopped allowing it. Success arrived and removed the hunger. The $100 million deal arrived and removed the financial desperation. McFarlane's expanding empire arrived and removed his daily presence from the work. The audience's expectations arrived and removed the creative freedom to surprise them with something genuinely unexpected. The characters' commercial value arrived and removed the ability to let them grow and change and become more complicated versions of themselves. Each of these things happened gradually across years, and each of them took something from the show that the show could not get back. The result is a legacy that exists in two completely separate pieces that happen to share a name. The first piece is 5 seasons of animated television that demonstrated what hunger and uncertainty and genuine creative risk can produce when the conditions are right and the people involved are talented enough to take full advantage of them. That piece of the legacy is secure. It does not need defending. The episodes are good enough to defend themselves simply by existing. The second piece is 20+ seasons of a show that kept going after those conditions disappeared, producing content that ranged from occasionally funny to genuinely poor, driven by momentum and commercial obligation, and the simple fact that nothing had happened to stop it. That piece of the legacy is also real, and it is also part of what Family Guy is. When you look at the full picture, you cannot talk honestly about Family Guy without acknowledging both pieces. What makes Family Guy's story worth telling, what makes it more than just another account of a television show that peaked early and declined, is the specific irony at its center. The fans who love the Golden Age show so much that they signed 111,000 petitions and bought 2.2 million DVDs and forced a television network to reverse a cancellation decision were the same fans whose love made the Golden Age impossible to sustain. By saving the show, they changed what the show was. By making it successful, they removed the conditions that had made it worth saving. The rescue and the damage were the same event. McFarlane knew this, in his way. His quote about the hiatus preventing fatigued brains is the quote of a person who understood that rest and uncertainty had done something for the show that continuous success could not do. His quote about escape velocity is the quote of a person who understands that the show is no longer moving towards something, but simply moving. His admission that he stopped writing the show in 2010, said plainly and without apparent regret in a public forum, is the admission of a person who had already made peace with what the show had become and what it had cost. The Golden Age of Family Guy was real. It produced genuine masterpieces of the form it worked in. It did things that had not been done before and that influenced everything that came after it, including the shows that publicly criticized it. It was made by a person with something to prove, under conditions that forced honesty and risk and genuine creative investment. That person still exists, and those episodes still exist, and they are still extraordinary. The show that replaced them is a machine. It is a very successful machine. It is a machine that will probably keep running for as long as the numbers justify it, producing new episodes of something called Family Guy for audiences who may never encounter the original thing that earned that name. Both of those things are true at the same time, and the distance between them is the whole story. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.